Hey there, tonight we're diving into the surprisingly precarious world of Roman architects, where drafting a blueprint might just land you in more hot water than a Roman bathhouse. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now make yourself cozy, maybe adjust your room temperature or get that cup of tea, and let's explore tonight's tale together. Welcome to the glamorous, exhausting, and occasionally perilous world of Roman architecture. You, my friend, have just stepped into the sandals of a Roman architect. Congratulations, or condolences. It's not exactly clear yet, because while you're about to contribute to some of the most iconic structures in history, you're also about to discover that the path to glory is paved with anxiety, political intrigue, and the ever-present threat of being unceremoniously dumped into the Tiber if things go south. First, let's talk about your boss. No, not the foreman, you wish. I'm talking about emperors, those grandiose figures who fancy themselves as gods incarnate with the divine, right to meddle in your blueprints. Take Emperor Nero, who, despite his musical ambitions, was less of a conductor and more of a wrecking ball on two legs. He decided to redesign large parts of Rome after the Great Fire of 64 AD, believing that a little urban renewal might polish his legacy. Spoiler alert, Nero's ambitions were as stable as a chariot with square wheels. Now, you might think you can just pop down to the Roman equivalent of Home Depot for materials. Wrong. Your most essential tool isn't a hammer. It's your ability to navigate the labyrinthine politics of Roman supply chains, where acquiring quality stone could involve bribing a senator or convincing a local governor to spare some of his province's finest marble. Speaking of marble, did you know that the prized lunar marble was shipped from Carrara, a journey that could take weeks and cost enough to bankrupt a local fishmonger's entire dynasty? And then there's Roman concrete, the ancient wonder that was as reliable as a politician's promise. Yes, it's true. Roman concrete, opus cementitium, if you want to impress your peers, was formidable. But here's the kicker. It didn't always set properly, especially when mixed by a slave who was more interested in sneaking off for a quick cup of wine. If your calculations were off, or your workers were feeling particularly rebellious, that concrete might just crumble faster than the reputation of a disgraced senator. But let's not get too cynical. Sure, the romantic image of Roman architecture as a seamless blend of art and science is about as accurate as a toga at a frat party. But that's not to say it wasn't impressive. Consider the Pantheon, a building that boasts a dome so vast and unreinforced, it still baffles architects today. However, this architectural wizardry didn't come cheap. Constructing such marvels required astronomical amounts of money. Take the Colosseum, whose final bill would make any modern-day accountant sweat through their toga. Estimates suggest it cost several hundred million sesterces, enough to bankroll a few legions for a good old-fashioned conquest. You also had to keep one eye on the political scene. A sudden change in leadership could mean the difference between your project being immortalized in marble or repurposed as a public latrine. Roman politics was a volatile cocktail of backstabbing, alliances, and occasional poisonings. Your career as an architect was less about drawing flawless lines and more about navigating these treacherous waters without ending up exiled, or worse, a gladiatorial snack. What about public opinion, you ask? Ah, the Roman mob, a fickle beast. They had the power to make or break projects based on whether they felt adequately entertained or fed. As an architect, you might have to appease them with grand spectacles, or assure them that their hard-earned tax sesterces were being well spent on public baths, and not just the emperor's latest vanity project. So, does being a Roman architect sound like fun yet? Don't worry, we've only scratched the surface. Next time, we'll delve deeper into the day-to-day chaos, from the grueling labor of the subjugated workforce to the logistical nightmares of building without modern technology. For now, rest assured that, while the life of a Roman architect was a complex game of wit, strategy, and a dash of luck, the structures you left behind would continue to stand as a testament to your skill and perseverance, long after even the most capricious of emperors had faded into the dusty scrolls of history. Now, let's dive into the logistical quagmire that was the Roman supply chain. Picture yourself not just as an architect, but as an ancient logistics manager, juggling a supply list that would make even Amazon's warehouses break a sweat. You're tasked with sourcing materials from across an empire sprawling over 3 million square kilometers. That's right, your building materials are playing a high-stakes game of hide and seek across provinces that stretch from the wind-lashed shores of Britannia to the sun-baked sands of Egypt. First up, let's talk about marble, because every Roman worth their salt knew that a building wasn't truly grand without a splash of this shiny status symbol. Lunar marble, mined from the quarries of Carrara in northern Italy, was the creme de la creme. But getting it to Rome wasn't just a matter of tossing it onto a cart and rolling it down the Appian Way. Nope, this was a Herculean task involving oxen, boats, and more patience than a parent with a toddler on a sugar high. Transporting marble from Carrara involved lugging it 100 kilometers to the coast, loading it onto ships bound for the port of Ostia, and then hauling it another 30 kilometers inland to Rome. And that's if everything went smoothly. Storms, shipwrecks, and the occasional pirate raid could turn your precious cargo into a poetic metaphor for lost fortunes faster than you could say, et tu, brute. But marble was just the tip of the iceberg. Rome's architectural appetite demanded a smorgasbord of other materials, each with its own logistical headaches. Timber from the dense forests of Germania had to be felled, floated down rivers, and seasoned before it could even dream of being part of a Roman roof. The journey could take months, with the added thrill of Germanic tribes occasionally deciding they wanted their trees back, preferably at the end of a sword. Then there were bricks, those humble building blocks that formed the backbone of many Roman structures. Despite their mundane appearance, bricks were a logistical nightmare. They had to be produced locally, as hauling them over long distances was about as efficient as using a sieve to carry water. This meant establishing kilns near construction sites, which added another layer of complexity and potential for disaster to your architectural endeavors. And let's not forget about lead. Yes, the Romans loved their lead, using it for everything from plumbing to roofing. But mining and smelting lead was no walk in the Forum. It required labor-intensive processes and a steady supply of slaves to keep the machinery of industry grinding. The lead mines in Britannia, for instance, were a hotbed of toil and turmoil, where slaves worked under brutal conditions, their lives as disposable as the pottery shards littering the streets of Rome. Economic considerations played a massive role too. The costs of transporting these materials were eye-watering. Shipping marble alone could set you back tens of thousands of sesterces, enough to buy a small villa or fund a gladiatorial game. Every delay, every hiccup in the supply chain was a potential financial sinkhole that could swallow your budget whole, leaving you to face the wrath of your senatorial sponsors. Navigating these logistical challenges required not just architectural brilliance, but a Machiavellian mastery of negotiation. You had to sweet-talk provincial governors into parting with their resources, all while dodging their not-so-subtle attempts to fleece you. It was a constant balancing act, a dance of diplomacy where one false step could see your carefully laid plans come crashing down like a poorly constructed aqueduct. And speaking of aqueducts, let's pour one out for the unsung heroes of Roman infrastructure, the water supply engineers. These folks had the unenviable task of sourcing materials for the vast networks that transported water from distant springs to thirsty cities. Building an aqueduct was like threading a needle from 100 miles away, and the logistics of it all could drive a lesser person to madness, or at least to a stiff drink of watered-down wine. Yet, despite all the headaches, the Roman architects and their teams of laborers, engineers, and slaves managed to pull it off. They transformed the empire into a landscape dotted with engineering marvels that defied the limits of ancient technology. The logistical nightmares, the supply chain snags, and the political machinations were all part of the grand tapestry of Roman construction, an epic saga of human ingenuity and resilience. So, as you stand in the shadow of a Roman arch or gaze up at a crumbling amphitheater, remember that these structures are more than just stones and mortar. They're a testament to the skill, endurance, and sheer willpower of those who navigated the treacherous waters of ancient logistics to bring them to life. And while the architects themselves may have faded from history's pages, their creations endure, whispering tales of ambition, adversity, and achievement to anyone willing to listen. But hold onto your togas. There's more to uncover about the gritty realities of Roman construction. We've still got labor disputes and ancient OSHA violations to explore. Stay tuned. As we journey deeper into the gritty realities of Roman construction, let's shine a light on the true engine behind those awe-inspiring edifices, the labor force. Oh, the labor force, a colorful tapestry woven from the threads of slaves, soldiers, and skilled laborers, each with their own set of grievances and quirks. If you thought the logistics of moving marble were a headache, try managing this motley crew. First up, the slaves. Yes, slaves. The backbone of Roman construction, they were as ubiquitous as the columns they erected. Forced labor was the empire's not-so-secret ingredient to architectural success, their lives often as expendable as clay parts in a pottery shop. While records are scarce on the exact numbers, it's estimated that slaves made up about a third of Rome's population, with many toiling away in construction. Envision them hauling stones, mixing concrete, and enduring grueling conditions that would make a modern sweatshop look like a day spa. The idea of safety regulations was as foreign to them as a hot shower. Now, you might think these slaves were just unfortunate souls caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the truth is, the Roman economy was practically addicted to slavery. Conquests across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East kept the supply chain flowing, with war captives being marched back to Rome faster than you can say, Veni, Vidi, Vici. For an empire that prided itself on engineering marvels, the real marvel was how efficiently they replaced broken bodies with new ones, never quite acknowledging the human cost. Then there were the soldiers. When they weren't busy expanding the empire's borders, they doubled as construction workers. Yes, your average Roman legionary was as handy with a trowel as he was with a gladius. Soldiers were often drafted into building projects, particularly when they were stationed in newly conquered territories. It was a two-birds-one-stone situation. Keep them busy and fortify the empire's new holdings. Yet, despite their rigorous training, these men were hardly masons. Their construction contributions were more about muscle than finesse, and their patience for masonry often ran as thin as a toga in a rainstorm. The skilled laborers, on the other hand, were the artisans, the true craftsmen who transformed raw materials into majestic structures. These were the stonemasons, carpenters, and metalworkers who held the secrets of Roman engineering in their calloused hands. They were a cut above the rest, not just in skill, but also in social standing. But even they weren't immune to the whims of fate. A fluctuating economy could see their wages plummet faster than a lead anchor, leaving them scrambling to make ends meet. And let's not forget the ever-present threat of a project being halted due to political upheaval or budget cuts. Now, if you think managing this workforce was a simple matter of barking orders and cracking the whip, think again. Roman architects had to navigate a complex social hierarchy where bribery, coercion, and negotiation were as essential as any blueprint. The lack of technology meant manpower was the go-to solution for any construction problem. Need to lift a massive stone block. Don't invent a crane, just throw a few hundred slaves at the problem. Sure, it wasn't efficient by today's standards, but when lives were cheap, why bother with innovation? In this context, the notion of safety was more of a suggestion than a rule. Picture a construction site with scaffolding that looked like it was held together by optimism and twine. The absence of hard hats and harnesses made each day a roll of the dice. Ancient Roman construction was a free-for-all where the only safety net was hoping the guards were in a good mood. The grand promises of public works, often just that, promises. The reality was a high-stakes game where survival was not guaranteed, and collateral damage was par for the course. Yet, despite the chaos, the grumbling, and the occasional catastrophic collapse, the Roman workforce managed to pull off feats that still leave us scratching our heads today. They turned chaos into order, stone into symbols of power, and sweat into structures that would stand the test of time. From the glistening columns of the Forum to the towering arches of the aqueducts, their legacy is a testament to human tenacity and the sheer will to build something greater than oneself. As we look back, it's tempting to romanticize these achievements, forgetting the blood and toil that fueled them. But history, my friends, is a double-edged sword. For every triumph, there's a shadow, a reminder of the price paid by those who labored in obscurity. So the next time you marvel at a Roman ruin, remember the hands that shaped it, and the lives that were forever changed in the process. And with that, we prepare to dive further into the intricacies of Roman construction. Stay tuned, because we've still got plenty of Roman grit and glory to explore. From the financial wizardry required to keep projects afloat to the intricate dance of politics and power, the story of Roman architecture is far from over. Prepare for more revelations, and remember, history is never as straightforward as it seems. Roman architecture, a world of triumphs and tragedies, where innovation danced precariously with disaster. Welcome to Part 4, the nitty-gritty of architectural genius and blunders that could make a Roman bathhouse look like a kiddie pool by comparison. Let's dive into the precarious life of a Roman architect, where glory and ruin were often just a stone's throw apart. Imagine, if you will, the architectural wonderland that was the Domus Aurea, Nero's infamous Golden House. Now, this wasn't your run-of-the-mill villa. It was a sprawling monument to one man's ego, stretching over 300 acres, a size that would make even the most extravagant of modern mansions look like broom closets. Nero, the emperor with a flair for theatrics, envisioned a palace so opulent it would make the guards green with envy. Think gold-leafed walls, a rotating dining room, and gardens that could swallow a small town. But here's the kicker. This architectural marvel was as stable as Nero's temper, shaky, unpredictable, and prone to implosion. Domus Aurea's construction was a textbook case of ambition over common sense. Employing innovative building techniques, the architects took risks that would make a daredevil sweat. They used concrete in ways that hadn't been attempted before, creating vast open spaces that were architectural marvels but structural nightmares. The grandiosity was undeniable, but like a Roman toga at a toga party, it barely held together under scrutiny. Now, you might be wondering, why would any architect gamble their career on such precarious designs? Well, in Rome, the rewards for success were as monumental as the risks. A job well done could see you showered with not just sesterces, but fame and favor, elevating you to a status previously reserved for guards and gladiators. But the flip side, a failure, especially one as public as a collapsing palace, could turn you into the punchline of every Roman joke faster than you could say, carpe diem. In this city that thrived on spectacle, a scandalous architectural failure was prime entertainment. The Roman populace was always hungry for a good story, and nothing satiated that appetite quite like the downfall of an overambitious architect. You see, Romans loved a good scandal almost as much as they loved their bread and circuses. Imagine your latest project, a majestic amphitheater, crumbling during its inaugural event. The spectators' gasps would echo louder than the gladiators' combat below, and you'd be left wishing you could fade into the very marble dust at your feet. The political fallout from such blunders was as brutal as it was swift. An emperor like Nero, with his penchant for blame-shifting, would happily pin the collapse on you, the hapless architect, rather than his own over-the-top visions. Your reputation, toast. Career prospects, less promising than a Roman Senate meeting devoid of backstabbing. But let's not forget the success stories, the architects who navigated this perilous path with skill and no small measure of luck. Take Apollodorus of Damascus. Yes, the guy whose name sounds like a spell from a wizarding world. This architectural maestro was the genius behind Trajan's Column, a triumph of Roman engineering and storytelling combined. Standing at 35 meters tall, it's an intricate scroll of stone depicting the emperor's victories in the Dacian Wars. No pressure, right? Apollodorus wasn't just building monuments. He was constructing narratives, weaving history into the very fabric of Rome. His work was a testament to the power of architecture, not just as shelter, but as a medium to immortalize the deeds of emperors long after their reigns had crumbled to dust. But even he wasn't immune to the whims of power. Legend has it that he met his end at the hands of Emperor Hadrian, supposedly for criticizing the emperor's architectural plans. Talk about a fatal flaw. Meanwhile, innovation in Roman architecture was a double-edged gladius. Consider the use of arches, those swooping curves that became synonymous with Roman engineering prowess. Arches allowed for the creation of vast, open spaces and significantly reduced the amount of material needed, which was a godsend in a city perpetually strapped for resources and patience. Yet they also required precise engineering and were vulnerable to even the slightest miscalculation. A poorly designed arch could topple like a house of cards, turning a triumph into tragedy in the blink of a Roman eye. And then there was the political landscape, a veritable minefield for those bold enough to push the boundaries of design. Rome's architects were like gladiators in the arena. One misstep, and they'd be at the mercy of the crowd's fickle favor. Emperors could be as capricious as the gods themselves, and a change in leadership could see your pet project scrapped or repurposed faster than a Roman horse could gallop. Yet, despite the risks, the allure of creation was irresistible. The chance to leave a mark on the eternal city was a siren's call, beckoning architects to dream bigger, build bolder. The ruins that dart the Roman landscape today are whispers of those dreams, remnants of an era where ambition soared as high as the columns they left behind. So why did it suck to be a Roman architect? Because you were constantly walking a tightrope, one misstep away from disaster. But let's be honest, the thrill of creating something that could stand the test of time was worth every sleepless night, every nerve-wracking inspection. The architects of Rome were the rock stars of their age, living fast, building faster, and hoping their legacy would endure longer than the latest scandal. As we look forward, there's more to uncover about the intricacies of Roman architecture. From the economic acrobatics needed to fund these grand projects to the social dynamics that shaped their creation, we've just scratched the surface. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the tapestry of history, exploring the grit, glory, and guts it took to build an empire. And remember, in the world of Roman architecture, the only certainty was uncertainty itself. As we wade into the murky waters of Roman architectural legacy, keep in mind that this empire was a bit like a band that had more hit singles than albums. Their architectural hits ranged from the Pantheon's gravity-defying dome to the engineering marvel of the aqueducts, which transported water with such precision that modern engineers still scratch their heads in admiration, or perhaps envy. So, how did these ancient creators leave a mark that still resonates louder than an emperor's ego? Well, buckle up, because the journey from crumbling ruins to timeless legacies is as twisty as a Roman road. First, let's talk about the Pantheon, because frankly, who wouldn't? Completed around 126 AD during Emperor Hadrian's reign, this building is like the bay and say of ancient architecture. Everyone knows it, everyone loves it, and it's still relevant. The Pantheon's iconic dome, measuring a whopping 3 meters in diameter, remains the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome. And yes, you heard that right. Unreinforced concrete. It's the architectural equivalent of walking a tightrope without a safety net, yet it stood for nearly 2 millennia. How's that for a testament to Roman engineering? Now, Roman architecture wasn't all about showstoppers like the Pantheon. The empire's real magic was in its infrastructure. Aqueducts, those graceful stone arches snaking across the landscape, were Rome's unsung heroes. They crisscrossed the empire for over 400 kilometers, supplying cities with fresh water and sparing ancient residents the hassle of fetching it themselves. In a city where public baths were more popular than modern-day Netflix, aqueducts were as essential as Wi-Fi. And for those who think Roman concrete was just ancient magic, here's the scoop. It was a carefully crafted mix of volcanic ash, lime, and water, chemically engineered to withstand the test of time better than most pop songs. But let's not get too carried away with the romance of Roman innovation. Behind every soaring arch and glistening column lay a tangled web of politics and economics that would make a soap opera look like a children's story. The construction of these grand structures was often funded by spoils of war, taxation, and sometimes good old-fashioned extortion. Public works were as much about political propaganda as they were about public benefit. An emperor's generosity in funding a new amphitheater was less about civic duty and more about securing his place in the annals of history, and possibly avoiding a one-way ticket to the afterlife courtesy of a political rival. Yet, despite the political machinations, the Roman architectural legacy is one of innovation that laid the foundations, literally and metaphorically, for future civilizations. The use of arches, vaults, and domes became a blueprint for Gothic cathedrals and Renaissance marvels. Even the humble Roman roads, stretching over 400,000 kilometers, set the standard for infrastructure that would shape Europe's development for centuries. These roads weren't just pathways. They were the veins of the empire, fostering trade, communication, and of course, military conquest. The saying, "all roads lead to Rome," wasn't just a catchy phrase, it was a logistical reality. Yet, as we marvel at these remnants of Roman greatness, let's not forget the darker side, the tension between innovation and collapse. Roman architecture was as much about hubris as it was about harmony. The very elements that made Roman structures revolutionary also sowed the seeds of their downfall. The reliance on slave labor, the ruthless political environment, and the constant push for grandeur often led to shortcuts and structural failures. The Domus Aurea, Nero's gilded dream, was buried just 4 years after his death, a victim of its own excesses and a public eager to erase the despot's memory. But here's the kicker. Despite these disasters, Roman architects are still remembered today, not just for their triumphs, but for their audacity. They dared to dream big, to push the boundaries of what was possible, and in doing so, they set a standard that architects have aspired to ever since. Sure, the path to glory was paved with as many pitfalls as triumphs, but isn't that what makes a legacy captivating? The drama, the tension, the near misses, and the eventual triumphs all weave a narrative that's as compelling as any epic. In the end, it didn't always suck to be a Roman architect. Sure, there was the constant threat of political fallout, financial ruin, and the occasional architectural disaster that could turn your career to dust faster than a sandstorm in the Sahara. But there was also the thrill of creation, the chance to leave a mark on history that would endure long after the empire itself had crumbled. Roman architecture was a dance of ambition and adversity, a testament to human ingenuity and the relentless pursuit of greatness. So, as you stand in the shadow of a Roman ruin or wander through the remnants of an ancient city, remember the architects who dared to imagine the impossible. Their legacy is a mosaic of triumphs and trials, a story that continues to inspire and intrigue. And that, my friends, is why, despite the odds, it was sometimes pretty incredible to be a Roman architect. In a world that constantly challenged their limits, they rose to the occasion, crafting structures that would echo through the ages, a fitting monument to the indomitable spirit of human creativity. In 14th century Italy, the events were as turbulent as a soap opera with a plague twist. Forget Rome's ancient glory. We're talking about a world where the Black Death decided to crash the party and left the guest list looking a bit sparse. By a bit sparse, I mean the population took a nosedive by a staggering 30–60%. It's like hosting a massive feast and having half the guests turn into ghosts, quite literally. But in a plot twist worthy of its own Netflix series, this Grim Reaper's visit paved the way for the Renaissance. Yes, the very period that would later be romanticized in every art history class, complete with grand frescoes and marble statues, was born from chaos and carcasses. Now, why did all this death inadvertently lead to economic opportunities? Well, when there are fewer people around to squabble over resources, those who survive suddenly find themselves with a little extra elbow room, and more importantly, cash. Land that was once crowded and overworked suddenly became available. The survivors, less numerous but more resourceful, could demand higher wages. And because misery loves company, the wealthy began to spend their newfound riches on art, science, and architecture to distract themselves from the apocalyptic vibes. Enter Florence, epicenter of this cultural explosion, a city that wore its wealth like a peacock, flaunting its feathers. At the heart of Florence's transformation was the Medici family, who were like the ultimate patrons of the arts, with a penchant for banking that would make modern Wall Street traders envious. The Medicis weren't just financiers. They were the puppet masters pulling the strings of Florentine politics. They bankrolled artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, who, let's face it, probably wouldn't have gotten far without some serious financial backing. Imagine today's equivalent of a venture capitalist funding tech startups, but instead of apps, they were investing in frescoes and chapels. But let's not get too starry-eyed about the Medicis. While their support undeniably sparked a cultural renaissance, they were also shrewd operators in the political arena. Cosimo de' Medici, for instance, wasn't just a patron of the arts. He was the master of behind-the-scenes power plays. He didn't hold office, but his influence was felt in every corner of Florentine politics. Think of him as the original political influencer without the Instagram account. The Medici family's financial antics were legendary. They pioneered modern banking practices, including the double-entry bookkeeping system, which sounds boring but was revolutionary. This system allowed them to manage complex financial transactions across Europe, making them not just art patrons, but central figures in the economic revival. Their banking operations extended all the way to Rome, Venice, and beyond. The Medici Bank was the financial lifeline of the papacy, which is a bit like being the go-to lender for today's top world leaders. They were the ultimate financial puppeteers, and Florence was their marionette. Yet, the legendary status of the Renaissance often glosses over the gritty details of daily life. While artists and thinkers were crafting masterpieces, the average Joe was dealing with the aftermath of the plague, political unrest, and the odd peasant revolt. The romantic image of the Renaissance as an era of enlightenment and beauty is only half the story. It was also a time of intense social upheaval and change, where the gap between the rich and poor was as vast as the frescoes painted on church ceilings. So, the next time you gaze upon a Renaissance masterpiece, remember it was born out of a world that was anything but serene. The cultural rebirth of Italy wasn't just a display of human brilliance, it was a testament to resilience amid disaster, a creative outburst following one of history's darkest chapters. And in the midst of it all, the Medici family stood as both saviors and schemers, their legacy immortalized not just in art, but in the very fabric of Florence. Their story is a reminder that behind every grand narrative of history lies a complex tapestry of human ambition, survival, and the occasional financial gamble. While the Medici were busy orchestrating their puppet show of power and wealth in Florence, the city itself was a veritable carnival of creativity and commerce. You'd think the place was auditioning for the role of cultural epicenter of the universe. The streets were alive with the hum of merchants, the clatter of horse-drawn carts, and the chatter of artists who were basically the Taylor Swifts and Beyoncés of their day. Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci didn't just make art, they made waves. Forget your modern-day influencers. These guys had patrons willing to shell out the medieval equivalent of millions to get a piece of their genius. And who were these patrons? Well, they were the billionaires of the Renaissance, the Jeff Bezoses and Elon Musks of the Quattrocento. They were the people who knew that art wasn't just about hanging something pretty over the fireplace. It was an investment, a status symbol, a way to flaunt your sophistication and wealth. A single fresco could cost as much as 500 florins, roughly $250,000 today. Not exactly pocket change. It was a time when art was the Bitcoin of its age, volatile, lucrative, and the talk of every dinner party. Now, let's talk about our two main headliners, Michelangelo and Leonardo. These guys weren't just artists, they were practically demigods. Michelangelo with his chisel, sculpting pieces that would make even the ancient Greeks nod in approval. His David was the Renaissance answer to the question, can art be both beautiful and politically charged? Standing at 17 feet tall, David wasn't just a marvel of marble. He was a symbol of Florentine strength and independence. Then there was Leonardo, the original Renaissance man. When he wasn't busy painting the Mona Lisa, he was dabbling in engineering, anatomy, and botany. He was the kind of guy who made you wonder if he had more hours in the day than the rest of us. His notebooks were filled with sketches of flying machines and designs for armored vehicles, a sort of medieval Shark Tank pitch, if you will. But let's not deceive ourselves into thinking it was all about high-minded ideals and artistic purity. The fierce competition among Italian city-states, Florence, Venice, Milan, turned art into a kind of cultural arms race. These cities were like high school cliques, each vying to outdo the other in grandeur and innovation. Commissioning art was not just a matter of taste, but a political statement. If your city could boast the most impressive cathedral or the most captivating fresco, you were essentially flexing your civic muscles. This competitive spirit was fueled by vanity as much as it was by ambition. Renaissance patrons were like the original Instagram users, curating their lives to project an image of sophistication and success. The more art you had, the more cultured you appeared. It was an age where vanity became a catalyst for innovation, pushing artists to new heights and dragging the rest of society along for the ride. This was no mere hobby, it was serious business. In the midst of this artistic whirlwind, Florence was a crucible of ideas. Workshops buzzed with apprentices learning the tricks of the trade, filling in backgrounds and mixing pigments, while their masters focused on the masterpieces that would cement their legacy. Artisans were like the unsung heroes of this epic saga, the roadies to the rock stars, ensuring that every brushstroke was perfect. But the myth of the lone genius toiling away in solitude is just that, a myth. Art was a collaborative effort, a team sport. Michelangelo didn't single-handedly paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling. He had a whole crew working behind the scenes. And while Leonardo is often portrayed as a solitary thinker, he thrived in the bustling environment of the Florentine workshops, exchanging ideas with fellow artists and scholars. This explosion of creativity wasn't just confined to the arts. It spilled over into science, literature, and philosophy. The Renaissance was a time when boundaries were blurred and disciplines intersected. It was an age of polymath, where being a jack of all trades was not only encouraged but celebrated. The pursuit of knowledge was seen as a noble endeavor, and the thirst for learning was unquenchable. Yet, as we peel back the layers of this seemingly idyllic period, we find a world that was as much about struggle as it was about splendor. The common people of Florence, while living in a city that was the envy of Europe, faced their own set of challenges. The gap between the wealthy patrons and the everyday citizens was as wide as the Arno River. While the elite commissioned altarpieces and sculptures, the average Florentine was more concerned with the price of bread and the whims of the ruling class. The Renaissance was not just a period of artistic rebirth. It was a time of economic upheaval and social transformation. The shifting tides of power and wealth created a dynamic, yet volatile environment. It was a world where fortunes could be made and lost in the blink of an eye, where the next big thing was always around the corner, and where the stakes were as high as the spires of the newly built cathedrals. So, as we stroll through the streets of Florence in our historical imagination, let's not forget the dual nature of this extraordinary era. It was a time of both light and shadow, of inspiration and intrigue. The Renaissance dazzles us with its brilliance, but it also challenges us to look deeper, to understand the complexities of a world that was as flawed as it was fascinating. And in this intricate tapestry of history, the artists, patrons, and ordinary people played their parts, each contributing to a legacy that continues to captivate us to this day. As we meander through the vibrant corridors of Renaissance Florence, it's easy to get swept up in the artistic whirlwind, but now it's time to pack our bags and take this cultural roadshow beyond Italy's sun-drenched piazzas. The Renaissance was too big to be confined to just one boot-shaped peninsula. It was like the greatest band you've never heard of going on a world tour, with the Gutenberg press playing the role of the ultimate PR agent. Johannes Gutenberg, the man with the plan, invented the movable type printing press around 1440. This contraption was basically the 15th century equivalent of that share button you click on your social media posts. Before Gutenberg, books were copied by hand, one painstaking letter at a time, an enterprise as slow as molasses in January. But Gutenberg's invention, it cranked out books faster than you can say Renaissance Revolution, and at a fraction of the cost. Suddenly, ideas were zipping across Europe faster than a caffeine-fueled intern could brew the boss's morning espresso. The first major book off the Gutenberg press was the Bible, printed in 1455, but it didn't stop there. By 1500, the number of printed editions in Europe had ballooned to an astounding 20 million. Books were no longer the exclusive toys of the elite. They became the building blocks of a new, literate society. The press took the Renaissance from a local Italian affair to a continental sensation. It was like going from underground indie band to headlining Coachella. And what ideas were these new books peddling, you ask? Well, that brings us to humanism, the intellectual spark lighting up Europe's collective imagination. Humanism was the philosophical equivalent of switching from black and white TV to color. It was all about focusing on human potential and achievements rather than the divine or supernatural. It was a movement that dared to ask, what can humans achieve on their own? A question that tickled the fancies of many a Renaissance thinker. Humanists weren't just navel-gazing philosophers, though. They were Renaissance rock stars. Figures like Erasmus of Rotterdam and Thomas More were penning works that challenged the status quo and poked holes in the fabric of medieval scholasticism. Erasmus, with his sharp wit and sharper pen, criticized the church's excesses in Praise of Folly, while More's Utopia offered a radical vision of a society built on reason and equality. These were the TED talks of their time, shaking up dinner parties and tavern debates alike. The humanist movement also laid fertile ground for the scientific revolution that was to follow. By emphasizing observation and empirical evidence over blind adherence to dogma, humanism paved the way for figures like Copernicus and Galileo to challenge the geocentric model of the universe. It was like swapping out astrology for astronomy, and the cosmos would never look the same again. Yet, let's not romanticize this as an era of unbridled freedom and intellectual exploration. These newfangled ideas weren't always welcome with open arms. The church, feeling its authority wane, wasn't too pleased about being sidelined in the intellectual limelight. Books were banned faster than you could say heretic, and censorship was the name of the game in many parts of Europe. Galileo, for instance, found himself on the wrong end of the Inquisition for his heliocentric theories. He was forced to recant, and legend has it that as he left the courtroom, he muttered, "E per si muove," and yet it moves. Talk about a mic drop moment. Humanism and the spread of Renaissance ideas weren't just academic exercises. They were cultural lightning rods, challenging the very foundations of medieval thought. This intellectual ferment was as controversial as it was exhilarating. It was like the Renaissance was throwing a party, and everyone was invited, except those who didn't want to dance to the new beat. Meanwhile, as ideas spread like wildfire, they ignited different reactions across the continent. In England, for example, the Renaissance took on a distinctly literary flavor. Figures like William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe were weaving humanist themes into their plays, turning the stage into a place where societal norms could be questioned and human emotion dissected. It was as if the bard himself had taken a crash course in Renaissance humanism and decided to write the ultimate syllabus for the ages. In France, the Renaissance had a courtly flair, with King Francis I positioning himself as a patron of the arts and a proponent of humanist education. He invited Leonardo da Vinci to his court, and the artist arrived with the Mona Lisa tucked under his arm, a cultural exchange that was worth more than any diplomatic treaty. The French Renaissance was as much about sophistication and style as it was about substance, echoing the courtly love traditions of medieval chivalry while embracing the new humanist ethos. The spread of Renaissance ideas wasn't just a top-down affair, though. This was a cultural movement that seeped into every nook and cranny of European society, challenging norms and sparking new ways of thinking. It was an intellectual free-for-all that saw the old hierarchies of knowledge upended and new voices emerging from the din. The Renaissance was a time when the boundaries between disciplines blurred, and everyone from artists to scientists to philosophers was invited to the party. But like all great parties, not everyone was thrilled by the new playlist. The Reformation was lurking just around the corner, poised to challenge the Catholic Church's authority and further disrupt the established order. Martin Luther's 95 Theses were a manifesto of discontent, a call to action that would reverberate across Europe. The printing press, once again the unsung hero, spread Luther's ideas far and wide, ensuring his message would reach every corner of the continent. So, as we wrap up this leg of our Renaissance journey, remember that the spread of these ideas was both a blessing and a curse. It was a time of great enlightenment, but also of great conflict, a period where the human spirit soared, even as it was shackled by fear and tradition. The Renaissance was a time when Europe was both eager to embrace the new and reluctant to let go of the old, a tension that would play out in the centuries to come. And with that, our tale is set to continue as the Renaissance Roadshow rolls on, leaving its indelible mark on the world stage. Stay tuned for the next act, where we'll dive deeper into this transformative era, unraveling the complex tapestry of human history, one thread at a time. And as the Renaissance Roadshow blazed its trail across Europe, leaving behind a glittering wake of art and ideas, it also cast some long, ominous shadows. You see, the Renaissance wasn't all about fluffy cherubs and divine frescoes. It had a darker side, a side that was less about enlightenment and more about power struggles, deception, and, surprisingly, a fair bit of bloodshed. Enter Niccolo Machiavelli, the man who could teach a masterclass in realpolitik complete with a syllabus that might make even the most seasoned politicians break out in a cold sweat. Ah, Machiavelli. The name alone conjures images of shadowy corridors and whispered intrigues. Born in Florence in 1469, he was a civil servant turned political prisoner, a Renaissance man of a different sort. His seminal work, The Prince, is often mistaken as a guidebook for tyrants, but it's actually more of a brutally honest playbook on politics. Machiavelli didn't sugarcoat things. He once wrote, "It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both." It's the kind of advice that would get you booted from a modern-day self-help seminar, but was pure gold in the cutthroat corridors of Renaissance power. But why did Machiavelli become synonymous with cunning and manipulation? Well, The Prince was penned during a time when Italy was a patchwork of warring city-states, each jockeying for dominance like contestants on a particularly vicious reality show. Florence, Venice, Milan, and the Papal States were in constant conflict, and alliances shifted faster than politicians' promises. Machiavelli's advice was simple. Rulers should be prepared to act immorally when necessary, because, in the world of Renaissance politics, the ends often justified the means. And speaking of political theatrics, let's zoom in on the papacy. If you think modern politics is a dirty game, the Renaissance papacy was playing in a league of its own. The church wasn't just a spiritual authority. It was a political powerhouse with its own territories, armies, and ambitions. The Papal States were as much about power as they were about piety. One of the most notorious figures to wear the papal tiara was Rodrigo Borgia, better known as Pope Alexander VI. His papacy from 1492 to 1503 was like a season of House of Cards meets The Godfather. The Borgias were infamous for their ruthlessness and nepotism, treating the papacy as a family business. Alexander VI's reign was marked by scandal and corruption, with whispers of simony, selling church offices for cash, and even more sinister deeds. It's rumored that he held lavish banquets in the Vatican, where political deals were made over goblets of wine, and rivals were dealt with as casually as a faulty tapestry. Underneath this veneer of sophistication, the Renaissance harbored a festering fear that manifested in witch hunts and religious persecution. In a time when science was making strides, superstition still held a firm grip on the collective imagination. The Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, published in 1487, became the go-to manual for identifying and prosecuting witches. It was the kind of bestseller that would make you glad there was no medieval equivalent of Opera's book club. Witch hunts spread like wildfire across Europe, with tens of thousands accused of witchcraft, many of them women who were outcasts or simply unlucky enough to have a neighbor with a grudge. And then there was Martin Luther, the cantankerous monk who kicked off the Reformation with his 95 Theses in 1517. Luther wasn't just nailing complaints to a church door. He was hammering a wedge into the very foundation of Catholic Europe. His grievances against the church's sale of indulgences and other excesses resonated with many, sparking a religious upheaval that would have consequences for centuries. The printing press, ever the Renaissance's trusty sidekick, ensured Luther's ideas spread faster than a viral cat video, fueling debates and divisions across the continent. The Reformation wasn't just a theological dispute. It was a social and political revolution. It challenged the authority of the Pope, leading to the formation of Protestant churches, and in some regions, outright war. The Holy Roman Empire, a patchwork of territories loosely united under an emperor, became a battleground, with princes choosing sides like a medieval game of Risk. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 attempted to quell the chaos by allowing rulers to choose between Catholicism and Lutheranism for their realms. But the religious tension simmered on, setting the stage for future conflicts. So, as much as the Renaissance was about the birth of new ideas and artistic brilliance, it was also a time of struggle and strife. Power was a slippery beast, pursued with fervor and defended with ferocity. It was a period when the same minds that contemplated the heavens could also be embroiled in hellish plots. The Renaissance reminds us that human history is rarely a tale of unblemished glory. It is a complex tapestry woven with threads of both light and darkness. As we navigate this intricate web, it's crucial to remember that the Renaissance was not a monolithic experience. It was a time of great achievements and profound challenges, a testament to the dual nature of progress. The stories of Machiavelli, the Borgias, and the reformers like Luther are not just chapters in a history book. They are mirrors reflecting the complexities of ambition, belief, and the relentless march of time. And as we leave this part of the story, poised on the edge of further exploration, we carry forward the reminder that history is a narrative woven from both the sublime and the sinister. Stay tuned for what comes next as the Renaissance continues to unravel its many layers. As we leave behind the tangled web of Renaissance intrigue, it's time to ponder the legacy of this extraordinary period. The Renaissance was like the world's most chaotic talent show, where art, science, and philosophy competed for attention amidst a backdrop of political drama and religious upheaval. Yet, out of this tempest of creativity and conflict emerged ideas that would shape the very soul of Western culture, laying the foundation for the Enlightenment and beyond. Let's start with individualism, the Renaissance's gift that keeps on giving. During the Middle Ages, life was more about playing your part in the grand cosmic order than striking out on your own. But the Renaissance, with its revolutionary shift in focus, put the individual center stage. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci and writers like Dante Alighieri weren't just creating masterpieces, they were redefining what it meant to be human. Leonardo's notebooks brimmed with sketches and musings, revealing a mind as curious about the mechanics of flight as it was about the divine beauty of the human form. This new focus on individual potential and self-expression was like giving humanity a mirror and saying, "Take a good look. You're capable of greatness." This emphasis on individualism didn't just revolutionize art and literature. It seeped into the very fabric of society. The Renaissance humanists, with their love of classical antiquity, placed a renewed emphasis on education and the cultivation of personal virtue. Suddenly, the idea that everyone had the potential for greatness took hold, and education became the key to unlocking that potential. Schools sprang up like mushrooms after a rainstorm, and literacy rates began to inch upwards, creating a more informed and engaged populace. The seeds were sown for a society where individual achievement and personal merit would become the benchmarks of success. But hold on, let's not forget about secularism, another Renaissance revolution that would send ripples through the centuries. While the Middle Ages were dominated by the Church, the Renaissance saw a gradual shift towards secular thinking. This wasn't about ditching religion altogether. It was more about finding a balance. Artists and thinkers began to explore themes beyond the strictly spiritual, turning their gaze towards the natural world and the human experience. This shift was nowhere more evident than in the realm of art, where biblical scenes shared space with portraits of merchants and landscapes that celebrated the beauty of the earthly realm. In literature, secular themes blossomed in the works of writers like Geoffrey Chaucer and Giovanni Boccaccio. Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales offered a colorful tapestry of medieval life, with characters as varied as a bawdy miller and a devout nun, each with their own story to tell. Boccaccio's Decameron, set against the backdrop of the Black Death, was a bold exploration of love, wit, and human folly. These works celebrated the richness of human experience, warts and all, and paved the way for a literary tradition that saw value in the here and now. And then there's empirical research, the Renaissance's high-octane fuel that powered the scientific revolution. While medieval scholars were busy poring over ancient texts, the Renaissance thinkers asked a radical question. What if we actually looked at the world around us? This seemingly simple shift in perspective unleashed a wave of scientific inquiry that would change the course of history. Figures like Copernicus and Galileo dared to gaze upwards and question the celestial order, while anatomists like Andreas Vesalius took a scalpel to long-held medical dogmas, revealing the human body's inner workings with unprecedented detail. The Renaissance emphasis on observation and experimentation laid the groundwork for the scientific method, a systematic approach to inquiry that would become the cornerstone of modern science. It was as if humanity had taken off its blinders, and for the first time truly looked at the world, eager to understand its mysteries through first-hand observation rather than inherited wisdom. This was no mere intellectual exercise. It was a transformative shift that would propel the West into an age of unprecedented scientific and technological advancement. But here's the kicker. This period, famed for celebrating human potential, was born out of turmoil and crisis. The irony isn't lost on history buffs. How a time of plague, war, and political upheaval could birth such a profound cultural and intellectual renaissance. The Black Death, which wiped out a staggering third to half of Europe's population, didn't just leave a trail of devastation. It also reshaped societal structures. With fewer people to work the land and fill the coffers, survivors found themselves in higher demand. Wages rose, social mobility increased, and a burgeoning middle class began to emerge, setting the stage for a new social order. Economic factors weren't the only game changers. The political landscape of the Renaissance was a patchwork quilt of city-states and burgeoning nation-states, constantly jostling for power and influence. Patronage became a tool for political maneuvering, as rulers and wealthy families competed to sponsor the most brilliant minds of their time. In this highly competitive environment, the arts and sciences flourished, funded by patrons eager to outshine their rivals and leave a lasting legacy. Yet, as we ponder the Renaissance's legacy, it's important to remember that this was no golden age of unbridled freedom. The spirit of inquiry and innovation often collided with entrenched traditions and authority. The Church, while losing ground to secularism, still wielded considerable power, and heresy trials were not uncommon. The Renaissance was a time of great intellectual ferment, but also of great risk. Trailblazers like Galileo found themselves in the crosshairs of the Inquisition, forced to recant their groundbreaking ideas or face dire consequences. And let's not overlook the darker aspects of this Renaissance legacy, which included its role in paving the way for colonial expansion. The age of exploration, driven by the same spirit of curiosity and ambition, led to the discovery of new lands and the exploitation of their resources and peoples. The Renaissance opened the doors to a global age, but it was a door that swung both ways, bringing both knowledge and conquest. As we wrap up this whirlwind tour of Renaissance wonders, it's clear that this period wasn't just a chapter in history. It was a turning point. Its legacy is a complex tapestry woven with threads of individualism, secularism, and empirical research, each strand representing a shift in the way humanity viewed itself and the world. The Renaissance was a time of contradictions, where the sublime and the sinister danced hand in hand, leaving an indelible mark on the Western world. In the end, the Renaissance reminds us of the power of human potential, the resilience to rise from the ashes of adversity, and the courage to question the status quo. It was a period that dared to dream, to imagine a world not yet realized, and in doing so, laid the foundation for the modern age. So next time you gaze at a painting or ponder a scientific discovery, remember the Renaissance. It's not just a bygone era of cherubs and chiseled marble. It's a testament to the enduring spirit of innovation and the complex, often contradictory nature of human progress. In the year 1792 BCE, in the bustling, dusty heart of Mesopotamia, a young man named Hammurabi was poised to become the king of Babylon. Now, if you think being a king was as straightforward as sitting on a throne and occasionally waving a scepter, think again. Hammurabi was stepping into a geopolitical cage match where city-states were squabbling like contestants on a chaotic game show. Picture Mesopotamia as a giant chessboard, but instead of orderly moves, you've got city-states that are constantly on the brink of flipping the board entirely. Hammurabi might have been young, but he wasn't naive. He knew Babylon was a bit of an underdog in a field crowded with heavyweights like Larsa, Isin, and the big bad wolf of the region, Elam. Each of these players had their own agendas, and alliances were as stable as a Jenga tower in an earthquake. Hammurabi needed to play his cards right, and play them he did. He wasn't about to let Babylon get swallowed up by its more powerful neighbors. To understand why Hammurabi's rise to power mattered, you first need to grasp the economic malaise of the time. Mesopotamia wasn't exactly the land of milk and honey. It was more like barley and bricks, lots and lots of bricks. The economy was agrarian, relying heavily on agriculture and trade. But droughts and floods, those pesky acts of God, often made a mockery of human efforts. To call the economy volatile would be like calling a tornado a bit windy. The city-states were constantly at each other's throats over resources, canals, and trade routes. It was like a never-ending episode of Survivor, Mesopotamian edition. Hammurabi inherited a kingdom that was not only trying to keep its head above water, but also needed a serious makeover. He wasn't just inheriting a crown, he was inheriting a potential economic disaster. But here's where the magic, or perhaps the cunning, of Hammurabi comes into play. He saw an opportunity to transform Babylon from a middling city-state into a powerhouse, and he wasn't going to rely on sheer luck or divine intervention. Instead, he decided to turn Babylon into the Mesopotamian version of a reality show, full of laws and order. You might even call it keeping up with the Babylonians. In the grand tradition of rulers who use religion to legitimize their power, Hammurabi claimed divine backing from Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. Marduk's favor was like the Mesopotamian equivalent of a presidential endorsement, only with more lightning bolts and slightly fewer campaign ads. This divine backing was crucial. After all, nothing says, "Obey me," quite like the threat of godly disapproval. Hammurabi's ascent wasn't just about flexing military muscle, although he certainly wasn't afraid to do that when necessary. Instead, he was a master of strategic alliances and shrewd diplomacy. He played the city-states against each other like a maestro conducting a symphony of chaos. He managed to forge beneficial alliances with some, while making sure others were too busy squabbling among themselves to pose a threat to Babylon. The geopolitical landscape of Mesopotamia was like a game of Risk, minus the plastic pieces and with a lot more at stake. The Elamites were constantly threatening, and cities like Larsa and Isin were vying for dominance. But Hammurabi saw the bigger picture. He wasn't just interested in short-term gains. He had his eyes set on the future, a future where Babylon was the center of the world. Now, let's take a moment to appreciate the awkwardly ambitious young king at the center of this story. Hammurabi wasn't just a pawn in this complex game. He was the one flipping the board, and maybe adding a few extra pieces when nobody was looking. His ambition was matched only by his savvy understanding of what it took to rule in such tumultuous times. He understood that power wasn't just about military might. It was about control of resources, trade routes, and most importantly, the hearts and minds of his people. While Hammurabi was certainly no pushover, he knew that sheer force wouldn't win the day. You see, conquering a city is one thing, but keeping it in check is a whole other ballgame. Hammurabi's genius lay in his ability to consolidate power, not just through conquest, but through the creation of a cohesive legal and administrative system. He wasn't just building walls around Babylon, he was building the very foundation of its society. In a world where might often made right, Hammurabi introduced the radical idea that perhaps laws should say too, and this was a game changer. By 1755 BCE, Hammurabi had not only expanded Babylon's territory, but had also laid the groundwork for a code that would become legendary. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. For now, it's enough to recognize that the stage was set for Babylon's transformation, and Hammurabi was the man with the plan, or at least the guts to make one. So, next time you think of ancient kings as just a bunch of guys in fancy robes and big hats, remember Hammurabi. He wasn't just ruling Babylon, he was reinventing it, turning it into a reality show of laws and order, with enough drama and intrigue to keep an entire region on its toes. And in a world teetering on the edge of chaos, that was no small feat. Hammurabi, with a flair for the dramatic and a thirst for order that would make Marie Kondo proud, was about to drop the mic on ancient jurisprudence. Cue the spotlight on the Code of Hammurabi, an iconic legal manifesto etched into a stone stele like a Mesopotamian mixtape of justice. This wasn't just any stone. It was a diorite monolith, standing nearly 7 feet tall. Think of it as the ancient world's version of a billboard, ensuring every passerby could catch a glimpse of the king's grand vision for society. Let's talk numbers. 282 laws, meticulously carved into this imposing slab, covering everything from property disputes to personal injury claims. Hammurabi's code wasn't just a collection of rules. It was the legal equivalent of a Swiss Army knife, addressing the myriad issues of a burgeoning urban society. And it had something for everyone, landowners, merchants, slaves, and everyone in between. It was a legal buffet, with more options than a modern-day brunch menu. Now, let's clear up a common misconception. Hammurabi didn't invent laws. The idea of a legal system was already kicking around in Mesopotamia like a well-worn pair of sandals. Earlier codes existed, like the Code of Ur-Nammu, but Hammurabi's contribution was its sheer scope and approachability, or as approachable as a stone slab can get. This code was less about reinventing the wheel and more about strapping on a shiny set of rims. The laws themselves are a fascinating window into Babylonian society, with penalties that ranged from fines to physical punishment. If you thought today's legal system was complex, imagine navigating one where an eye for an eye wasn't just a metaphor, but a literal judicial outcome. Yes, the infamous lex talionis, the law of retaliation, makes its star appearance here. The principle of reciprocal justice, often misinterpreted as barbaric, was actually about setting limits on retribution. It was less about escalating violence and more about ensuring that justice didn't turn into a never-ending episode of revenge of the Babylonians. Take, for example, law number 196. If a man put out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. It might seem harsh by modern standards, but in a world where personal vendettas could spiral out of control faster than a Twitter beef, this was Hammurabi's way of keeping the peace. An eye for an eye wasn't just a punishment. It was the ancient version of conflict resolution. Talk about a tough love approach to diplomacy, but let's not get too carried away with the spectacle of justice. The Code of Hammurabi was also about everyday life. It laid down rules for commerce, contracts, interest rates, and wages, turning Babylon into a well-oiled machine of trade and enterprise. Law 104, for instance, stipulated that a merchant could charge interest on a loan, but there was a catch. The interest couldn't exceed 20%. Hammurabi might have been the original financial watchdog, ensuring that usury didn't turn into outright robbery. Property rights were another cornerstone of the code. Law 42 dictated that if a tenant farmer failed to cultivate land, they had to pay compensation to the landowner. This wasn't just about protecting property. It was about ensuring productivity and economic stability. Hammurabi understood that an idle field was as useless as a broken plow, and his laws aimed to keep Babylon's agricultural engine running smoothly. The code also delved into family matters, with laws that would make any modern family therapist raise an eyebrow. Law 129 decreed that if a wife was caught cheating, she and her lover would be tied up and thrown into the river. It's not exactly the kind of marriage counseling you'd expect today, but it reflected the societal norms and gender dynamics of the time. In a world where honor and reputation were everything, such severe punishments were meant to deter more than to punish. Now, here's where things get interesting. Hammurabi's code wasn't just about punishment, it was about responsibility. Take Law 23, for instance. If a thief wasn't caught, the city and its governor were responsible for compensating the victim. This was revolutionary. It held the state accountable for maintaining order. In a sense, Hammurabi was laying the groundwork for the social contract, centuries before philosophers would wax poetic about it. Of course, no discussion of the Code of Hammurabi would be complete without addressing its class distinctions. The code wasn't exactly a model of egalitarianism. Laws applied differently depending on one's social status, with varying penalties for the same crime. For instance, Law 202 stated that if a nobleman struck a commoner, he had to pay a fine. If roles were reversed, the punishment could be much harsher. It's a stark reminder that, while Hammurabi's code was a step towards legal equality, it was still a product of its time, with all the social stratification that entailed. And let's not forget the economic underpinnings of Hammurabi's legal masterpiece. Babylon wasn't just a hub of legal innovation, it was an economic powerhouse. The code ensured that trade, both local and international, could flourish under a framework of trust and accountability. Law 108, for example, regulated the operations of taverns, prohibiting them from accepting grain as payment. This wasn't just about preventing drunkenness, it was about stabilizing the currency and preserving the integrity of the marketplace. In crafting these laws, Hammurabi wasn't just wielding power, he was weaving the fabric of society, one law at a time. He understood that to rule an empire, you needed more than an army, you needed a vision. And while his steel might be silent now, its echoes resonate through history, reminding us that even in the ancient world, the law wasn't just about order. It was about justice, however imperfect. So, as we marvel at this ancient legal code, let's remember the king who dared to dream of a society bound not by chaos, but by the rule of law. Hammurabi didn't just etch laws into stone. He carved his name into the annals of history, setting the stage for the legal systems that would follow. And while we may not always agree with his methods, there's no denying the audacity of his vision. A vision that transformed Babylon from a dusty city-state into a beacon of civilization. So, as we're knee-deep in Hammurabi's ancient world, let's take a closer look at how his legal magnum opus reshaped the economic and social fabric of Babylon. If you thought the code was just a glorified list of do's and don'ts, think again. It was more like the Swiss Army knife of ancient governance, carving out rules for everything from borrowing your neighbor's ox to family affairs that would make a modern soap opera seem tame. First up, let's talk trade. Babylon wasn't just any city. It was the Las Vegas of Mesopotamia, minus the neon lights, but with all the hustle. Hammurabi's laws put guardrails on commerce, ensuring the bustling marketplace didn't turn into the Wild West with camels instead of horses. Merchants were bound to specific interest rates, with Law 100 capping them at 20%, a real buzzkill for any would-be loan sharks. You see, Hammurabi understood that unchecked greed could lead to economic chaos faster than you could say 2-for-1 barley sale. But beyond interest rates, the code tackled the nitty-gritty of contracts. Law 104, for instance, mandated written agreements for loans, making sure nobody could pull a fast one with a wink and a handshake. It was like the notary public of its day, minus the awkward small talk. This move wasn't just about trust. It was about creating a stable economic environment where trade could flourish without everyone constantly looking over their shoulder. Now, let's shift gears to agriculture, the lifeblood of Babylon's economy. Picture the land as Babylon's breadbasket, where every farmer was a cog in the great agrarian machine. Hammurabi knew that to keep the granaries full, he needed to keep the farmers in line. Enter Laws 42 and 43, which stipulated that tenant farmers who failed to cultivate their fields owed compensation to the landowner. It was the ancient equivalent of paying rent, but with more dirt under your fingernails. Hammurabi's agricultural laws weren't just about productivity. They were about survival. In a world where a bad harvest could spell disaster, ensuring that every acre was tilled and sown was a matter of life and death. And for those who dared to neglect their duties, there were penalties that would make a modern eviction notice look like a love letter. Speaking of survival, let's not forget about those oxen, Babylon's version of the family car. Law 53 made it clear that if you borrowed your neighbor's ox and somehow managed to drown it in a canal, you'd be liable for the loss. It's like borrowing your buddy's truck and returning it in pieces. Not exactly the best way to win friends and influence people. Such laws were designed to protect valuable resources and maintain harmony among neighbors, because nothing says neighborhood feud like a missing ox. But it wasn't just about keeping the peace with livestock. Family life got a legal makeover too. Hammurabi's code delved into domestic affairs with all the subtlety of a reality TV producer. Laws like 148 and 149 addressed divorce and inheritance, ensuring that family squabbles didn't escalate into full-blown drama. In a patriarchal society, the code provided a semblance of protection for wives and children, albeit with a heavy dose of patriarchal bias. Law 128, for instance, allowed a husband to divorce his wife if she failed to bear children, but he had to return her dowry. Talk about a consolation prize. Hammurabi's legal provisions weren't just about fairness, they were about stability. A society embroiled in familial chaos was a society on the brink of collapse. By codifying family roles and responsibilities, Hammurabi aimed to prevent domestic disputes from becoming public spectacles, a lesson perhaps lost on many of today's reality TV stars. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, social class. The code of Hammurabi wasn't exactly a bastion of equality. Laws applied differently based on one's status, creating a legal landscape where not all eyes were equal. A nobleman who injured a commoner faced a fine, while the reverse could result in harsher consequences. This wasn't just about maintaining order. It was about preserving the social hierarchy that kept Babylon's wheels turning. Despite this, the code did offer a level of protection for the less fortunate, at least by ancient standards. Laws like 148 provided some rights for women, allowing them to leave a marriage if their husband failed to fulfill his obligations. A small but significant step towards legal recognition. While the code's class bias might make our modern sensibilities cringe, it's important to remember that for its time, it was a radical attempt to impose some measure of fairness in a world dominated by power and privilege. In crafting this legal tapestry, Hammurabi wasn't just a lawgiver, he was a visionary. He understood that a society governed by rules was one that could thrive, even in the face of adversity. The Code of Hammurabi was his blueprint for a functioning civilization, a bold experiment in governance that laid the groundwork for future legal systems. As we continue to unravel the complexities of Hammurabi's code, it's clear that this ancient set of laws was more than just a relic of the past. It was a living document, one that sought to balance the scales of justice in a world teetering on the edge of chaos. And while its methods might seem harsh, its legacy endures, a testament to a king who dared to dream of order in a world governed by might. So, as we ponder the economic and social impacts of Hammurabi's legal legacy, let's not forget the king who turned Babylon into a beacon of civilization. He wasn't just a ruler, he was an architect of society, building a legal framework that would echo through the ages. And while we may not always agree with his methods, there's no denying the audacity of his vision, a vision that continues to captivate us, even today. Stay tuned, because the drama of Hammurabi's Babylon is far from over. We've got more ground to cover, and who knows what other surprises lie hidden in the dusty corridors of ancient history. But let's not just talk about Hammurabi's laws as if they were simply a stack of stone-carved statutes gathering dust in some ancient corner of the Louvre. The real genius wasn't just in churning out laws. It was in how Hammurabi sold them, both to his subjects and to the ages. You see, if the Code of Hammurabi was a mixtape of Babylonian justice, then Hammurabi himself was its DJ Khaled, masterfully spinning an image that would echo down through history. First, let's talk about the stele itself, the tall diorite billboard of Hammurabi's legal brilliance. Standing nearly 7 feet tall and inscribed with 282 laws, this monument was more than a mere rock. It was an ancient advertising campaign. Picture it, the imposing figure of Hammurabi, receiving the laws directly from Shamash, the sun god and divine judge. This isn't just a legal document. It's a celestial endorsement. It's like getting your local traffic laws signed off by Zeus himself. The message was clear. These laws weren't just man-made. They were divine mandates. Now, in the spirit of myth-busting, let's be real. Did every Babylonian really read this stele like it was the morning newspaper? Probably not. Literacy rates in ancient Babylon weren't exactly through the roof, and the text was in cuneiform, which isn't exactly user-friendly. But that wasn't the point. The stele's real power lay in its symbolism. It was the ancient equivalent of a viral tweet. Its reach far exceeded its actual audience. Hammurabi was a pioneer of public relations, a spin doctor long before the term was coined. He understood that to keep his kingdom in line, he needed more than soldiers and scribes. He needed a narrative. And this narrative wasn't just etched in stone. It was spread through word of mouth, stories, and the very walls of the cities. The stele was installed in a prominent location, a visual reminder of the king's wisdom and divine backing, a constant nudge that the eyes of the law and the guards were always watching. With this savvy move, Hammurabi managed to transform his image from just another ancient ruler into the definitive wise lawgiver. The old adage, seeing is believing, certainly played a role here. By literally casting his laws in stone, he cemented his legacy as not just a king, but a divine intermediary, a master craftsman of justice. The stone stele became a symbol of order in a world teetering on chaos, even if the average Babylonian was more likely to hear about the laws than read them. But let's not pretend this was all about law and order. Hammurabi was crafting a persona, a brand. And like any good brand, it was as much about the perception as the product. By aligning himself with Shamash, Hammurabi wasn't just showcasing legal prowess. He was asserting his place as a chosen leader, one whose authority came from the heavens. In a time when divine right was the gold standard of governance, this was Hammurabi's platinum card. The marketing genius didn't stop there. Hammurabi's narrative was reinforced by a network of officials, scribes, and priests who acted as the ancient world's PR team. These were the storytellers who spread the tales of Hammurabi's wisdom far and wide, ensuring that his reputation as a just ruler reached every corner of his kingdom. While the laws themselves were complex, The story was simple: obey and prosper, disobey and face divine retribution. And let's not forget the economic savvy behind this grand campaign. By creating a unified legal code and promoting it so effectively, Hammurabi wasn't just flexing his legal muscles. He was laying down the groundwork for a stable, prosperous society. A society where traders felt secure, where farmers knew their rights, and where the threat of divine justice kept everyone in line. It was a masterstroke of governance, ensuring that Babylon's economy could flourish under the watchful gaze of the gods. Of course, the real test of any PR campaign is its longevity. So, how did Hammurabi's image hold up? Well, considering we're still talking about him nearly 4,000 years later, I'd say he nailed it. His legacy as a wise lawgiver has endured, not just because of the laws themselves, but because of the mythology he built around them. The Code of Hammurabi wasn't just a set of rules. It was a story, one that continues to captivate and intrigue us to this day. In the end, Hammurabi's success as a king was as much about the image he projected as the laws he enacted. He understood that to rule effectively, a king needed more than just might. He needed a myth. And so, with the stroke of a chisel, Hammurabi carved out not just a legal code, but a legend. A legend that would transform Babylon from a city-state into a beacon of civilization, and himself from a mere mortal into a timeless icon. But don't pack away that time-traveling passport just yet. We've got more to explore in the winding alleys of ancient Babylon. So stay tuned as we continue to unravel the intricacies of Hammurabi's reign, a saga of ambition, law, and the indomitable human spirit. As we step away from the dusty alleys of Babylon, let's zoom out and take a good, hard look at the ripple effect Hammurabi's legacy has had across time. This isn't just about a king scribbling rules onto a stone slab. It's about how those chiseled decrees set a precedent that would echo through the corridors of history, louder than a gossip in a medieval court. Hammurabi's code wasn't just a legal checklist. It became the blueprint for justice systems that stretched far beyond the boundaries of ancient Mesopotamia. Fast forward a few centuries, and you'll find Hammurabi's influence still kicking around in the legal systems of the Greeks and Romans. Sure, those toga-wearing thinkers like to imagine they were reinventing the wheel, but let's give credit where credit's due. The concept of codified laws that Hammurabi championed, a structured legal system accessible to all, became a cornerstone of Roman law. It was like the ancient world's version of open-source software. Take it, tweak it, make it your own, but don't forget who laid the groundwork. But let's not get too misty-eyed about the noble aspirations of ancient lawgivers. The truth was, Hammurabi's code was as much about consolidating power as it was about justice. In a world where might often made right, the law offered a veneer of fairness that could keep the masses from revolting. Forget the romantic notion of justice for all. This was justice for the sake of stability. After all, a kingdom in chaos is hardly a kingdom at all. As time rolled on, Hammurabi's legacy took on a life of its own. By the Middle Ages, his name was being whispered in the hallowed halls of European universities. Legal scholars, those medieval bookworms, pored over ancient texts, marveling at the wisdom of the Babylonian king and his eye for an eye philosophy. Though let's be real, medieval justice wasn't exactly known for its subtlety. Hammurabi became a symbol of the law's power and permanence, his name synonymous with the very concept of a legal code. Yet, as is often the case with history, the reality was more nuanced than the legend. While Hammurabi's code was groundbreaking, it wasn't exactly a utopia of fairness. Social hierarchies were baked into the laws, with different rules for different classes. It's a reminder that justice, even when etched in stone, has always been a moving target, shaped by the whims of those in power. Fast forward to the Enlightenment, and Hammurabi's code was back in vogue, this time as an emblem of rational governance. Enlightenment thinkers, those idealistic dreamers, hailed Hammurabi as a pioneer of reason and order. His code became a touchstone in debates about the balance of power and the role of the state in enforcing justice. But as always, the devil was in the details. The Enlightenment may have romanticized Hammurabi's laws, but it often glossed over the harsh realities of ancient life. It's easy to idealize the past when you ignore the bits that don't fit your narrative. In the modern era, Hammurabi's influence is still palpable, his name invoked in discussions about legal reform and the evolution of justice. The eye for an eye concept, often misunderstood and misquoted, looms large in debates about proportionality in punishment. And while we like to think our modern legal systems are more sophisticated, the core principles that Hammurabi laid out, accountability, proportionality, and the rule of law, continue to resonate. So, what are we really left with after all this time? Hammurabi's legacy is a testament to the enduring power of law as a tool for governance. It's a reminder that while laws may be written in stone, their interpretation is anything but rigid. The beauty of Hammurabi's code lies not just in its content, but in its adaptability, its ability to inspire generations of lawmakers to seek order in chaos. But let's not sugarcoat it. Hammurabi's world was harsh, and his laws reflected that. The romantic image of a wise king dispensing justice often obscures the cold reality of a ruler wielding power in a brutal landscape. Yet, it's precisely this tension between romance and reality that gives Hammurabi's story its staying power. It's a narrative of ambition, pragmatism, and the unending quest for a just society. A quest that, despite our best efforts, remains as elusive today as it was in ancient Babylon. As we pull back from the shadow of Hammurabi's towering steel, let's remember that his legacy is not just about the laws he laid down, but the conversation he started, a dialogue that has stretched across millennia, questioning, challenging, and redefining what it means to live under the rule of law. In the grand tapestry of history, Hammurabi's code is not just a chapter, but a foundation, a testament to the enduring human struggle to balance power with justice. So as you drift off, perhaps pondering the complexities of ancient legal systems or the curious ways in which history repeats itself, take a moment to appreciate the audacity of a king who dared to dream of order in a world governed by chaos. Hammurabi may be long gone, but his influence lingers, a silent echo in the halls of justice, reminding us that while the past is a foreign country, its lessons are never out of reach. If you've ever wondered who the original hipsters were, you probably need to look a bit further back than thrift store flannel and ironic tattoos. Say hello to the Etruscans, ancient Italy's very own trendsetters who kickstarted a cultural revolution in Rome long before Julius Caesar could even say, "Et tu, Brute." Let's rewind to around 900 BCE, when the Etruscans were busy being enigmas wrapped in a mystery, shrouded in the Mediterranean mist. These folks made their home in what we now call Tuscany, a region that's still synonymous with style and sophistication, though these days it's more about wine and fewer togas. Their origins, still a bit of a head-scratcher. Some say they were indigenous to Italy. Others suggest they sailed over from Asia Minor, bringing their flashy new ideas and a taste for the good life. And boy, did they know how to live it. The Etruscans were the cool kids on the Italian peninsula, turning heads and setting trends, while everyone else was still figuring out which end of the spear was pointy. Their cities were the OG urban centers, laid out in a grid pattern that would make any city planner swoon. They even had paved streets and drainage systems, a big thumbs up to hygiene in an era when most people were still chucking their waste out the window. But it wasn't just their city planning that was ahead of the curve. The Etruscans had a knack for architecture that was the stuff of legend, literally. Ever heard of the Roman arch? Yeah, that was an Etruscan innovation. Before the Romans were busy building aqueducts and colosseums, they were taking notes from these guys, who were already mastering the art of constructing temples and tombs with an elegance that hinted at their fondness for the dramatic. Speaking of drama, the Etruscans were quite the thespians. Their love for theater and music wasn't just for entertainment. It was woven into their religious rituals, which were as elaborate as a modern-day awards show. This flair for the theatrical was something the Romans would later adopt, turning their own public spectacles into grand productions that were part political propaganda, part entertainment, and all spectacle. And let's not forget the Etruscan contribution to language. Ever notice how the Latin alphabet is suspiciously similar to the one we use today? You can thank the Etruscans for that. They adapted the Greek alphabet to their own needs, and in turn passed it on to the Romans, who then spread it like wildfire across Europe. Talk about leaving a legacy. But it wasn't just infrastructure and letters that the Etruscans handed over to their Roman neighbors. Their religious beliefs and rituals were also borrowed, altered, and adopted into Roman culture. The Etruscan practice of augury, interpreting the will of the gods by studying the flight patterns of birds, became a staple of Roman religious practice. Who knew bird watching could be so divine? Now, you might be wondering, if the Etruscans were so influential, why aren't they headlining history books like their Roman proteges? Well, here's where things get a bit grim. Despite their early dominance, the Etruscans fell victim to the same fate as many a hipster band, overshadowed by their more mainstream successors. By the late 4th century BCE, Rome had grown from a scrappy upstart to a burgeoning power, and in a classic case of "thanks for the help, now step aside," they gradually absorbed Etruscan territory. But while the Etruscans might have faded from the political scene, their cultural fingerprints were all over Rome. From public games and gladiatorial contests to religious ceremonies, the Etruscan influence was as indelible as a tattoo, one that the Romans wore proudly, even if they didn't always give credit where credit was due. So next time you sip that Chianti or marvel at a Roman ruin, give a nod to the Etruscans, the unsung hipsters who were setting trends before it was cool. Because without them, Rome's cultural tapestry might have been a whole lot less colorful. And let's face it, who wants a boring toga party? Now, let's get down to the nitty-gritty of the Etruscan economy, the real backstage pass to understanding how these ancient trendsetters bankrolled their lavish lifestyles, and more importantly, how they set Rome on a path to financial glory. Trust me, it wasn't all just wine and ceremonial dances. First off, the Etruscans were masters of metalwork, and I'm not talking about some quaint little DIY project you find on Pinterest. We're talking about heavy-duty metallurgy that would make any Iron Age blacksmith weep with envy. They were rolling in metals like iron, copper, and tin, which they extracted like pros from the mineral-rich Tuscan hills. This metallurgical wizardry wasn't just for crafting shiny trinkets or intimidating warrior gear. No, it was a full-blown industry that powered their economy and funded their societal escapades. By the 7th century BCE, they were trading these metals all across the Mediterranean like a Black Friday sale gone right. What's more, the Etruscans didn't just stop at metal. They also had a knack for agriculture, making the most of the fertile lands of Tuscany. They cultivated grains, olives, and grapes. Sounds like the makings of a good Mediterranean diet, right? But beyond the dining table, these crops were serious business. They traded their agricultural bounty far and wide, forming trade networks that connected them to the likes of Greece and the Near East. They weren't just tilling fields. They were planting the seeds of economic influence that would eventually blossom in Rome. But let's not get too romantic about it. The Etruscans' wealth wasn't just the result of hard work and savvy trading. No, there was a darker side to their economic success, a reliance on slavery and strict land ownership rules. The Etruscans were early adopters of a system where owning land equaled power, and they held onto it with an iron grip. Land was passed down through male heirs, reinforcing a patriarchal society that kept wealth concentrated in the hands of a few elite families. It was a bit like a grim game of Monopoly, where only a handful of players ever reached go. And then there were the slaves, captives from military campaigns or unlucky souls from neighboring regions. These individuals were the backbone of the Etruscan economy, laboring in fields, mines, and households. While the Etruscan elite enjoyed the fruits and metals of their labor, the reality was far less glamorous for those at the bottom of the social ladder. It's a stark reminder that even the most sophisticated societies have their shadows. Now, if all this sounds eerily familiar, it's because these economic practices made quite an impression on the Romans. When Rome began to expand, it borrowed heavily from the Etruscan playbook. The Romans took the concept of land ownership and slavery and ran with it like an Olympic relay team, eventually building an empire that relied on similar principles, but on a much grander scale. The Etruscans had laid the groundwork, and Rome was more than happy to pave over it, adding their own twists and turns. And let's not overlook the Etruscans' strategic knack for trade. By establishing extensive trade routes, they connected their cities not just with other Italian regions, but with the broader Mediterranean world. This wasn't just about making a quick buck. It was about positioning themselves as a central hub of commerce. They facilitated the exchange of goods, culture, and ideas, turning their cities into melting pots where diverse influences blended into something uniquely Etruscan. This kind of savvy internationalism was something the Romans would later emulate as they expanded their own networks. So, the next time you think of the bustling Roman Forum, remember its Etruscan roots. The Etruscans didn't just hand the Romans a roadmap. They practically gifted them a fully equipped financial toolkit. Rome just added a few new gadgets and went global. It's a classic case of standing on the shoulders of giants, or in this case, the original Italian hipsters with a penchant for metal and a taste for the finer things in life. As we dig deeper into the Etruscan legacy, it becomes clear that their economic might wasn't just about what they had, but what they left behind. Their mastery of trade and agriculture, combined with their less savory practices, created a blueprint for prosperity that Rome would follow. It's a testament to how the allure of wealth and power can drive innovation and excess in equal measure. And while the Etruscans may have been overshadowed in the annals of history, their influence on Rome's economy is as enduring as ever. Stay tuned, because we're just getting started on this ancient Italian soap opera. So, while the Etruscans were busy setting up an economic playbook, they were also dabbling in a little political side hustle that would leave the Romans with both a blueprint and a cautionary tale. Picture this. Rome, the scrappy underdog of the Italian peninsula, is being ruled by kings with names that sound like they belong in a fantasy novel: Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and the infamous Tarquinius Superbus. What's the common thread here? Yep, you guessed it, the Etruscans. You see, before Rome was the republic we all know and love, or fear, depending on which side of the empire you were on. It was essentially the Etruscan side project. The Etruscans didn't just bring their love for dramatic architecture and stylish urban planning. They also exported their political system, which was a bit like letting your fun-loving cousin crash on your couch, only to realize they're taking over your living room, remote, and possibly your life. From around 616 to 509 BCE, Rome was under the reign of Etruscan kings. And while these rulers did bring some nifty upgrades, like the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's legendary sewer system, because even in ancient times, plumbing was power, they also instilled a fondness for monarchy that didn't sit well with everyone. In fact, these Etruscan kings were a bit of a mixed bag, much like that variety pack of chips where you love the BBQ flavor, but could do without the sour cream and onion. Tarquinius Priscus, the first Etruscan king of Rome, kicked things off with grand building projects and military expansions. Under his rule, Rome started looking more like a city with ambitions rather than a sleepy backwater town. But Priscus was just the warm-up act. His successor, Servius Tullius, was the real game-changer. Tullius introduced reforms that structured Roman society into classes based on wealth, kind of like an ancient version of your tax bracket. He also expanded the city and fortified its defenses, effectively laying the groundwork for Rome's future as a colossal powerhouse. But then came Tarquinius Superbus, a name that might as well be Latin for "I'm going to ruin everything." Superbus was less about public service and more about self-service. He's the monarch who put the super in supervillain, ruling with an iron fist and a penchant for tyranny that would make even a Marvel villain blush. His reign was marked by oppressive tactics, including a hefty reliance on violence and fear to maintain power. The Romans, not exactly fans of being ruled like extras in a dystopian flick, eventually had enough. The tipping point, the infamous incident involving Lucretia, a noblewoman whose tragic fate became the rallying cry for the Roman revolt. Her story was the straw that broke the camel's back, leading to a revolution that ousted the Etruscan kings and gave rise to the Roman Republic. It was a classic case of fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, we're forming a republic. By 509 BCE, the Romans had effectively handed the Etruscans their walking papers, saying, "Thanks for the infrastructure, but we'll take it from here." This transition from monarchy to republic wasn't just about swapping crowns for togas. It was a seismic shift in political culture. The Romans had tasted the bitter side of Etruscan rule and decided they preferred their leaders elected rather than self-appointed. The concept of a republic, where power rested with elected officials and the Senate, was a direct response to the heavy-handed monarchy they had experienced. It was a bold experiment in governance that would echo through history, influencing political systems for centuries. But let's not get too misty-eyed about the Roman Republic just yet. While the Etruscan kings had been banished, Their influence lingered like a houseguest who leaves behind an ungodly amount of sarks. The Romans might have kicked out the monarchy, but they kept some of the Etruscan traditions that suited them, like religious rituals, certain architectural styles, and the aforementioned sewer systems. They even borrowed the idea of a strong leader, albeit rebranded as a consul, who would serve a limited term to avoid any more superbus-style power trips. Yet, while this political transformation looked like a neat package of progress, it wasn't all smooth sailing. The transition to a republic was fraught with its own issues, including class struggles and political infighting that would make a modern election cycle look like a picnic. Patricians, Rome's aristocratic elite, often clashed with the plebeians, the common folk, in a battle for rights and representation. It took centuries of push and pull before the Roman Republic found anything resembling balance. So, while the Romans might have said, "Arrivederci," to their Etruscan rulers, they couldn't completely shake off the influence. The monarchy had left its mark, a reminder that even in the grand tapestry of history, some threads are tougher to unravel than others. The Etruscan kings taught Rome a valuable lesson. Power can be both a boon and a burden, depending on who's wielding it. And in their quest for self-governance, the Romans set out to find a middle ground, one that would allow them to grow and thrive without the shadow of tyranny. As we continue this historical journey, we'll explore how the Romans took these lessons to heart, sometimes with great success, other times with spectacular failure. But one thing's for sure, the influence of the Etruscan kings was a pivotal chapter in Rome's story, setting the stage for a republic that would redefine power, politics, and frankly, drama for generations to come. So, buckle up, because this ride through Rome's political evolution is only just beginning, and there are plenty more twists and turns ahead. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The Etruscan cultural influence on Rome is like a great movie soundtrack. Sometimes you hear it loud and clear, and other times it's subtly shaping the mood. Take religion, for instance. The Romans weren't exactly spiritual innovators. They had a knack for cherry-picking the best bits from other cultures, and when it came to divine matters, the Etruscans were their go-to gurus. The Etruscans were religious trendsetters, with rituals so elaborate they could give any modern-day ceremony a run for its money. Think of them as the ancient mixologists of spirituality, blending local beliefs with imported ideas from Greece and beyond. Rome, ever the opportunist, saw the value in these practices and incorporated them into their own religious framework. So, if you've ever wondered why ancient Roman religion sometimes reads like a cross between a bird-watching guide and a cooking recipe, blame or thank the Etruscans. One of the Etruscans' most famous contributions was the practice of divination, specifically augury and haruspicy. Augury was all about interpreting the will of the gods through the behavior of birds. Yes, you heard that right. They had certified bird watchers called augurs whose job was to observe avian flight patterns and decide if the gods were giving a thumbs up or down. Meanwhile, haruspicy was a bit more gruesome, divining the future by inspecting the entrails of sacrificed animals. Imagine being the ancient equivalent of a CSI, but with more entrails and less crime-solving. These practices weren't just eye-catching rituals. They were central to Roman decision-making. Want to declare war? Better check with the birds first. Planning a new public building? Consult the guts. It was like consulting a celestial Yelp review before making any big moves. And while some Romans might have rolled their eyes at the superstition, they didn't dare dismiss it entirely. After all, who wants to anger the gods over a zoning issue? But here's where things get spicy. The Romans had a love-hate relationship with these Etruscan practices. On the one hand, they swore by them. On the other, they loved to ridicule the Etruscans for their superstitions. It was a classic case of do as I say, not as I do. Roman writers often mark the Etruscans' intense religious devotion, yet they continue to rely on those same rituals for major decisions. It's the ancient version of pretending you don't believe in astrology while secretly checking your horoscope. Now let's delve into another juicy tidbit the Etruscans passed down: the gladiatorial games. If you thought the Romans invented the bloody spectacle of gladiator fights, think again. The Etruscans were the original impresarios of this grim entertainment form. It all started as a religious ritual, a sort of blood sacrifice to honor the dead. The Romans, who never met a good idea they couldn't make bigger, took these solemn ceremonies and turned them into the blockbuster events we know today. By the 3rd century BCE, Romans had transformed gladiatorial contests into massive public spectacles. They were part sport, part execution, and all theater. The Colosseum, completed in 80 CE, became the ultimate venue for these games, accommodating around 50,000 spectators. But let's not romanticize this as the ancient world's Super Bowl. For the gladiators, often slaves, prisoners, or condemned criminals, it was less about glory and more about survival. Economic context played a huge role here, too. Gladiatorial games were costly affairs, funded by wealthy sponsors seeking political favor or public adoration. It was a quid pro quo of bread and circuses, keep the populace entertained, and they might overlook the less savory aspects of Roman life. This was politics with a side of spectacle, a tradition that, let's be honest, hasn't entirely disappeared in the modern age. So, when Romans packed into the Colosseum, they were witnessing a cultural mashup. Etruscan religious roots met Roman ambition, creating an event that was as much about power and control as it was about entertainment. It was a grim reminder that even in ancient times, a crowd could be distracted with the right mix of drama and violence. In essence, the Etruscan influence on Rome was a complex cocktail of reverence and ridicule, adoption and adaptation. The Romans might have mocked the Etruscans for their peculiar practices, but they also recognized the utility in them. It's a tale as old as time. Borrow what works, laugh at what doesn't, and pretend you thought of it yourself. And while the Etruscans might not have gotten the credit they deserved, their legacy was etched into the very fabric of Roman culture, from the temples to the arenas. As we continue this historical deep dive, remember that the story of Rome is as much about the influences it absorbed as the empires it built. The Etruscans were the unsung architects of a civilization that would change the world, and their impact is still felt in ways both grand and mundane. So, as we peel back the layers of Roman history, let's keep an eye out for those Etruscan fingerprints, the subtle marks of a culture that whispered its wisdom through the ages, even if its voice was sometimes drowned out by the roar of the Colosseum crowd. Stay tuned, because there's more to uncover in this saga of ancient influence and ambition. As we peel back the layers of Roman history, let's keep an eye out for those Etruscan fingerprints, the subtle marks of a culture that whispered its wisdom through the ages, even if its voice was sometimes drowned out by the roar of the Colosseum crowd. Now, let's talk about the real kicker in this whole saga. How the Romans, who once saw the Etruscans as overlords to be ousted, ended up cherry-picking their culture like it was the latest trend at a Roman flea market. It's the ultimate historical plot twist, really. Rome's rise to power was like watching a rebellious teenager who eventually grows up to realize that maybe, just maybe, their parents had a point. The Etruscans might not have been the life coach Rome asked for, but they certainly were the one they needed. And the irony, while the Romans were busy pulling themselves up by their sandal straps, they were doing it with Etruscan tools all along. Take the Roman political system. After kicking the Etruscan kings to the curb, the Romans didn't just discard monarchy, they rebranded it. The concept of a magistrate with supreme power, albeit for a limited term, was a clever twist on Etruscan kingship. It was like taking a vintage record, adding modern beats, and calling it an original mix. But let's not forget the Senate, that august body of Roman governance. While the Etruscans had their councils of elders, the Romans turned this idea into a political powerhouse, proving that sometimes the best ideas come from a good brainstorming session over a goblet of wine. Now, let's not overlook the cultural flair that the Etruscans bequeathed to Rome like a second-hand wardrobe that somehow became haute couture. The Etruscans were masters of the dramatic arts, and their love for theater and spectacle was infectious. Rome, in its quest to entertain and control the masses, took these elements and added a dash of Roman grandeur. From the slapstick comedies performed during religious festivals to the epic tragedies that tugged at the heartstrings, Roman theater was a direct descendant of Etruscan drama. It was a classic case of if the toga fits, wear it. And speaking of togas, let's talk fashion. The Etruscans were the original Italian stylists, draping themselves in garments that were both functional and fabulous. The Romans, never ones to miss a fashion cue, adopted the toga as a symbol of Roman citizenship. It was like the ancient equivalent of a designer label, a mark of distinction that set Romans apart from their less sartorially inclined neighbors. So, while the Etruscans might have faded into the annals of time, their fashion sense lived on, wrapped around the shoulders of every Roman citizen worth their salt. But let's get down to brass tacks, or should I say, bronze and iron. The Etruscans didn't just leave behind a cultural legacy, they left a technological one that powered Rome's expansion. Their expertise in metalwork was the backbone of Rome's military might. The Romans took those metallurgical techniques and ran with them, crafting weapons and armor that would become the envy of the ancient world. It was the original arms race, and the Etruscans had given Rome a head start. Economically, the Etruscans' influence was like a gift that kept on giving. Their trade networks, which had once crisscrossed the Mediterranean, became the blueprint for Roman commerce. The Romans expanded these routes, trading goods and culture across Europe, Asia, and Africa. This wasn't just about swapping spices and silks. It was about establishing a global presence, one amphora at a time. And then there's religion, that ever-present thread weaving through the fabric of Roman life. The Etruscans were the spiritual forerunners, with their pantheon of gods and complex rituals. The Romans, pragmatic as ever, adopted these deities and practices, tweaking them to suit their own needs. It was a spiritual remix, and the Romans played it on repeat. Even the mighty Jupiter, king of the Roman gods, had Etruscan roots. It's like discovering your favorite song is actually a cover, eye-opening, but it doesn't make you love it any less. Now, let's put a bow on this Etruscan-Roman relationship. As much as the Romans would have liked to paint themselves as self-made conquerors, the truth is they were standing on the shoulders of Etruscan giants. It's a testament to the enduring power of cultural exchange, a reminder that what you resist can indeed persist, and sometimes it's for the better. The Etruscans might not have gotten top billing in the history books, but their legacy is etched in the stones of Rome, from the arches of the aqueducts to the columns of the Forum. In the end, the Etruscans were the unsung heroes of Rome's story. Their influence was like a whisper that became a roar, shaping the destiny of an empire and leaving a mark that time and tide could never wash away. So, the next time you stroll through the ruins of Rome or sip on a Tuscan wine, give a nod to the Etruscans. They were the trendsetters, the innovators, the original cool kids who left a legacy as enduring as the Italian sun. And perhaps that's the greatest irony of all. The civilization that faded into obscurity was the one that helped Rome shine the brightest. Lai Yuan probably never imagined his name would resonate through the ages when he first looked at the messy state of China in 618 AD. But then again, who does? Our boy Lai Yuan wasn't born into a world of peace and prosperity. He was dealing with the crumbling remains of the Sui dynasty, which had collapsed under its own weight, like a poorly constructed IKEA shelf. The Sui, bless their hearts, had overreached with grand projects, like the Grand Canal, and a series of disastrous campaigns against Korea. It was the classic story, go big, go broke. Lai Yuan, a seasoned general, wasn't content to play the fiddle while Rome, China, burned. He saw an opportunity amidst the chaos, and seized it with the kind of political savvy that would make Machiavelli nod in approval. You see, Lai Yuan wasn't just a warlord with a fancy title. He was the kind of guy who knew how to play the long game. By 618 AD, he declared himself emperor, and established the Tang Dynasty, which would go on to become one of the most culturally rich and vibrant periods in Chinese history. Now, let's talk about money because, let's face it, empires don't run on good intentions alone. The early Tang economy was like a startup that had just received its first round of funding. Lai Yuan had to figure out how to make the empire not just survive, but thrive. The Silk Road, that ancient superhighway of trade, was the key. It wasn't just a road. It was the internet of its time, connecting east and west, and bringing in the kind of cash flow that could fill imperial coffers faster than you can say, cha-ching. The Silk Road wasn't just about trading silk, despite what the name might suggest. It was more like a global marketplace where you could get anything from spices and precious stones to, believe it or not, glass from the Roman Empire. Oh, the irony. Romans were shipping fragile glass halfway across the world, while their empire was shattering at home. The Silk Road was a two-way street, literally and figuratively. It wasn't just goods that moved along this route, but also ideas, religions, and cultures, making it the original cultural melting pot. Lai Yuan's reign was all about laying the foundations, and he was as much a builder of roads as he was of alliances. He knew that a well-paved road meant more than just smooth rides. It meant military might, economic prosperity, and cultural exchange. It was a strategy game where the roads were the real MVPs, connecting the dots across the vast empire and beyond. Of course, no empire is built on silk and spices alone. There were those pesky little things called taxes. The Tang government was a pioneer in bureaucracy, creating a well-oiled machine that could squeeze taxes out of its citizens with remarkable efficiency. It was a win-win situation. The government got its revenue, and the people got to enjoy the benefits of infrastructure and protection. Well, enjoy might be a strong word, but at least they weren't living in constant fear of marauding barbarians. But let's not romanticize this too much. For all its glory, the Silk Road had its share of bandits and bureaucratic red tape. Traders had to deal with everything from sandstorms to extortionate tolls, reminding us that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Lai Yuan's government had to play a delicate balancing act, maintaining the flow of trade while keeping the peace, a challenge that would test his successors time and time again. Lai Yuan's time in power was relatively short, a mere 8 years. But in those years, he set the stage for a dynasty that would last nearly 3 centuries. He passed the baton to his son, Lai Shimin, who would become one of China's greatest emperors. But that's a story for another day. So, what's the takeaway here? The early Tang dynasty was a period of shrewd political maneuvering and economic innovation. Lai Yuan's legacy was not just an empire, but a blueprint for prosperity that would influence generations. It's a reminder that sometimes, in the chaos and collapse, there's room for a fresh start. A lesson as relevant today as it was over a millennium ago. And with that, we bid farewell to Lai Yuan, the man who turned his vision into the Tang dynasty reality. Lai Shimin, stepping into the imperial spotlight as Emperor Taizong, had some big shoes to fill, or perhaps sandals, given the time period. But if there was ever a guy ready to take the baton from dear old Dad and run a cultural marathon, it was Taizong. Under his reign, which kicked off in 626 AD, the Tang dynasty blossomed into a cultural powerhouse, and it didn't just happen by chance. Nope, Taizong had a plan, and it was all about making China the world's go-to destination for arts and literature. Think of him as the ultimate ancient art patron, like Medici, but with a penchant for Taoist philosophy. Taizong understood the power of culture, and its ability to cement a dynasty's legacy far beyond military conquests or economic exploits. He rolled out the cultural red carpet, encouraging poets, painters, and scholars to flourish like never before. The emperor himself was a poet and calligrapher, and he wasn't shy about showing off his skills. It's said that he could bust out a verse faster than you can say Confucius. And speaking of Confucius, Taizong was all about reviving Confucianism, which had taken a bit of a backseat during the chaotic years prior. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. Confucianism wasn't just about quoting wise old sayings and stroking one's beard thoughtfully. It was a full-fledged philosophical system that emphasized moral integrity, social harmony, and a hierarchical society. In other words, it was the ancient Chinese version of know your place and act accordingly. Taizong saw the value in dusting off these old scrolls and using Confucian ideals to stabilize the empire's social and political structures. It was as if he was saying, hey, let's bring back the good old days when everyone knew their role and stuck to it. Now, while Confucianism got its well-deserved comeback tour, Taizong also had another trick up his sleeve, the imperial examination system. This was the granddaddy of all standardized tests, and it wasn't for the faint-hearted. You think the SATs are tough? Try memorizing entire Confucian classics and then writing essays on how to govern a kingdom at the tender age of 16. The examination system was a meritocratic approach to hiring government officials, a novel concept at a time when nepotism was as common as chopsticks at dinner. The exams were held in the capital, Chang'an, and thousands of young men would flock there, scrolls in hand, ready to prove their scholarly worth. It wasn't uncommon for ambitious scholars to spend years, sometimes even decades, prepping for this academic marathon. And the competition, fierce doesn't even begin to cover it. Imagine a medieval version of the Hunger Games, but with ink and paper instead of bows and arrows. Pass rates were notoriously low, often around 2% or less, meaning the majority would go back home, probably to a chorus of better luck next time. Behind this rigorous system was the idea that the best governance came from the most educated and virtuous individuals, not just those with the right family connections. It was a noble concept, albeit one fraught with pressure, and let's face it, a fair share of mental breakdowns. Because let's be real, who wouldn't crack under the pressure of writing the perfect essay while being literally locked in a tiny cubicle for days on end? And yet, the appeal of social mobility was strong. For those who passed, the doors to government service swung wide open, offering not just a stable job, but the chance to influence the empire's future. But let's not romanticize this as some sort of academic utopia. The reality was, for every scholar who made it, there were countless others who languished in obscurity, their dreams of imperial service dashed. It was a system where brilliance could shine, yes, but also where luck played a wicked game of hide and seek. And still, the allure of becoming a civil servant was enough to keep the scrolls turning and the ink flowing. Of course, the examination system wasn't just about Confucian classics. The Tang Dynasty was a melting pot of ideas, thanks largely to the Silk Road's bustling trade routes. Buddhism, Taoism, and even some elements of foreign philosophies made their way into the curriculum, reflecting the diverse intellectual climate of the time. It was an era where a scholar could debate the finer points of Buddhist sutras one moment and then pontificate on Taoist metaphysics the next. In the midst of this cultural renaissance, the arts took center stage. Poetry became the lingua franca of the educated elite, with figures like Lai Bai and Du Fu penning verses that continue to resonate today. Their work wasn't just about beauty and elegance, though. It was often a commentary on society, politics, and nature, wrapped in the delicate folds of metaphor. Imagine Instagram poets, but with a lot more depth and a lot less hashtagging. And it wasn't just poetry. The visual arts flourished, too. Tang painters were known for their vibrant landscapes and intricate depictions of court life, where every brushstroke told a story. The era's fashion, a dazzling blend of silk robes and ornate accessories, often depicted in the art of the time. It was a period where style met substance, and the two danced a delicate waltz across the cultural stage. Taizong's court was a hub of intellectual exchange, a place where scholars and artists from various backgrounds could come together and create. It was a bit like a Renaissance fair, but with fewer turkey legs and more philosophical debates. By fostering this environment, Taizong wasn't just building an empire of stone and mortar. He was crafting a legacy of thought and creativity that would echo through the ages. And there you have it. The Tang Dynasty under Taizong, a period when culture bloomed like 1,000 cherry blossoms in the spring. It was a time of great intellectual and artistic achievement, driven by a visionary leader who understood the power of the pen as much as the sword. But don't think for a second that this cultural zenith was free from challenges or contradictions. Reality was as complex as a Tang poem, filled with layers of meaning and the occasional unexpected twist. But that's a tale for another day, as our story of the Tang Dynasty's unfolding drama is far from over. And so, as Taizong's cultural juggernaut rolled on with the grace of a calligraphy brush on rice paper, we arrive at the bustling heart of the Tang Dynasty, Chang'an. This was not just any city, it was the place to be, the ancient world's version of New York City, but with more pagodas and fewer hot dog stands. Chang'an, which translates to perpetual peace, was anything but calm. It was the most populous city on the planet, boasting a population north of 1 million people at its peak. Think of it as the metropolis that made all other cities feel like quaint villages. If you were a poet, artist, trader, or just someone with big dreams, Chang'an was your stage. It sprawled over 84 square kilometers, which in today's terms would be like squeezing a bustling metropolis into a space smaller than present-day Washington, D.C. Cozy, right? Now, let's talk city planning. The Tang Dynasty's urban planners had a thing for order and symmetry. Chang'an was meticulously designed with a grid pattern, featuring 108 walled residential wards and gates that controlled who came and went. Picture this. A city laid out like a chessboard, only instead of pawns and rooks, you had bustling markets, serene temples, and an emperor in the center, calling the shots. It was planned with the kind of precision that would make modern urban developers weep into their blueprints. The city was divided into two main areas, the imperial city and the outer city. The imperial city was the seat of power, where the emperor and his court handled the business of ruling a vast empire. Meanwhile, the outer city was where the magic happened, a vibrant mix of markets, workshops, and residential areas. It was a melting pot of cultures, thanks to the Silk Road's influence, making it as cosmopolitan as it was chaotic. And believe me, it was chaotic. With so many people crammed into one place, you can bet there were traffic jams, albeit of the horse-drawn variety. But here's a fun fact. Chang'an had an early form of public transport. Picture rickshaws, but without the wheels. People could hop on the backs of sedan chairs carried by porters. Hey, it beats being stuck in a modern-day subway car with questionable air conditioning, right? Now, let's not forget about the city's architectural marvels. The Tang Dynasty was like the Frank Lloyd Wright of ancient China, pushing boundaries with their innovative designs. For instance, the Daming Palace, the Tang Emperor's main residence, was a testament to their architectural prowess. The place was massive, covering an area of 11 square kilometers. That's about the size of 440 football fields, a grandiose statement of imperial might and opulence. The Daming Palace wasn't just about flaunting wealth. It was a hub of political power and strategic planning. It was here that the emperor would meet with officials, host foreign dignitaries, and occasionally pen a poem or two. You know, just to keep things interesting. Inside, the palace halls were adorned with intricate frescoes and luxurious materials, a display that screamed, "We've made it, folks." But let's not get too carried away with the grandeur. The reality of medieval urban life was less glamorous. Crowded streets and close quarters meant that sanitation was more of a hopeful suggestion than a guarantee. Imagine sharing your morning commute with livestock, and you'll get the picture. Disease and fire were constant threats, the latter especially terrifying in a city where wooden structures were the norm. It's no wonder that fire brigades were a necessary part of the city infrastructure, racing through the alleys with buckets of water in an attempt to save the day, or at least the block. Now, onto one of the Tang Dynasty's crowning achievements, their engineering feats. If you thought the Romans were the only ones capable of serious infrastructure, think again. The Tang were masters of canal construction, which was about as high-tech as it got in the medieval world. The Grand Canal, which the Sui dynasty started, was further developed by the Tang to become the longest artificial river in the world, spanning over 700 kilometers. It was like the I-95 of ancient China, connecting the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, enabling goods to flow as freely as the water itself. Speaking of water, the Tang engineers knew its value. They constructed elaborate canal networks to irrigate their agricultural lands, ensuring the empire didn't just survive but thrived. These canals were the arteries of the empire, carrying rice, wheat, and other staples to bustling markets. The impact, a population that could eat, trade, and grow, all thanks to the foresight of those who understood that controlling water was akin to controlling wealth. And while we're busting myths, let's address the idea that ancient cities were all about palaces and pagodas. The truth is, a lot of the Tang Dynasty's success came down to the less glamorous but equally vital bits of infrastructure. Roads were built and maintained with military precision, connecting remote regions to the empire's core. This network of roads wasn't just about trade. It was a strategic asset, allowing the rapid movement of troops and information. It was the internet of its time, ensuring that if a rebellion sparked in some distant province, the emperor would know about it faster than you can tweet uprising. So, was Chang'an a utopian paradise of culture and luxury? Well, yes and no. Its streets were filled with the sounds of market haggling, the colors of diverse cultures, and the hustle of daily life. But it was also a city where the gap between the wealthy elite and the struggling masses was as wide as the Grand Canal. For every opulent palace, there were countless homes that were one step above hovels. The allure of the city was undeniable, but so were the challenges of living in such a densely packed urban arena. Chang'an was a city of contrasts, opulence and poverty, innovation and tradition, peace and chaos. It was the beating heart of an empire that was as complex as it was powerful, a place where the past and future collided in a kaleidoscope of culture and commerce. And while it may not have been perfect, no city ever is. It stood as a testament to human ingenuity and ambition. As we look forward, remember that the Tang Dynasty's story doesn't end here. The tale of Chang'an, with its bustling streets and grandiose architecture, is just one chapter in an epic saga. there's more to uncover, from the highs of cultural zeniths to the lows of political intrigue. So, stay tuned as we continue this journey through one of history's most fascinating periods, where every turn of the page brings you deeper into the world of the Tang Dynasty. And speaking of epic sagas, let's dive into the Tang Dynasty's international escapades. Picture the empire expanding like a game of Risk, with Emperor Taizong and his successors rolling the dice and hoping for sixes. The Tang Dynasty wasn't just about poetry and palaces. They had serious ambitions to make their mark on the global stage. From Korea to Central Asia, the Tang emperors weren't content to sit back and watch the world go by. They wanted a piece of the action, and they were willing to go the distance to get it, quite literally. Let's start with the Korean peninsula, where the Tang Dynasty's military ambitions met their match. Taizong, riding high on his domestic successes, decided to extend his reach into Goguryeo, one of the three kingdoms of Korea. Why? Well, the usual suspects: prestige, influence, and a strategic location that could serve as a launchpad for further expansion. But here's the twist. The campaign wasn't the glorious conquest the Tang court probably envisioned. Nope, it was more like a medieval version of a quagmire, with muddy boots and all. In 645 AD, the Tang army, under the steely command of Taizong himself, marched into Goguryeo with about 60,000 troops ready to make history, or so they thought. But the reality was, conquering Goguryeo was about as easy as trying to fold a fitted sheet. The kingdom's formidable fortifications and tenacious defenders gave the Tang forces a run for their money. And when I say money, I mean it. Wars weren't cheap. The campaign drained resources faster than you can say imperial overreach. Despite the Tang's superior numbers and resources, Goguryeo geography was a nightmare for invaders. The rugged terrain and harsh winters were no friends to the Tang soldiers, whose march into battle turned into a slog through mud and misery. After a series of brutal engagements, the campaign ended in a stalemate, and Taizong had to retreat, licking his wounds and plotting his next move. It was a classic case of biting off more than you can chew, proving that sometimes even emperors need to respect the local geography. But wait, there's more. The Tang weren't just about military might. They were also quite the diplomats. When brute force failed, they turned to diplomacy, using alliances and marriage as their weapons of choice. The Tang court was a revolving door of ambassadors and envoys from all corners of Asia, each one eager to curry favor with the emperor. This wasn't just about tea and pleasantries. It was high-stakes political poker, with each player trying to outmaneuver the others. Now, let's pivot to Central Asia, where the Tang dynasty really flexed its diplomatic muscles. They established the Yangtze Protectorate in the Tarim Basin around 640 AD, a region that was as strategic as it was sprawling. This wasn't just about planting a flag. It was a calculated move to control the silk routes and secure a steady flow of goods and ideas. The Tang emperors knew that whoever controlled the trade routes controlled the treasure, and they were determined to be that power. The Protectorate was a melting pot of cultures and a hub for trade, where merchants from Persia, India, and beyond rubbed shoulders with Chinese officials. It was like the United Nations of its time, minus the endless speeches and awkward handshakes. The Tang were adept at managing these complex relationships, balancing diplomacy with the occasional display of military might to keep everyone in line. But let's not get too misty-eyed over this diplomatic ballet. The reality was, the Tang were playing a dangerous game of geopolitical chess, and the stakes were high. Their expansionist policies put them on a collision course with the Tibetan Empire, another regional powerhouse with its eyes on Central Asia. The two empires clashed repeatedly, each vying for control over the lucrative trade routes and strategic outposts. It was a classic case of too many cooks in the geopolitical kitchen, leading to conflicts that ranged from heated skirmishes to all-out war. And then there's the romanticized image of the Tang dynasty as a benevolent empire, spreading culture and enlightenment wherever they went. The truth, it was more complicated than that. While the Tang did bring cultural exchange and technological advancements to many regions, their expansion came with a cost. Local populations often bore the brunt of these imperial ambitions, facing conscription, heavy taxes, and the occasional sacking of their cities. It was a reminder that the glow of empire often casts a long shadow. So, What's the takeaway from all this historical drama? The Tang dynasty's international relations were a masterclass in balancing ambition with reality. They were as skilled in diplomacy as they were in wielding a sword, understanding that both were necessary tools in the imperial toolkit. But for all their successes, the Tang also faced the harsh lesson that empires, like all things, have limits. The romantic tales of epic conquests and benevolent rule were just that, tales, often obscuring the gritty reality of power and politics. As we continue our journey through the Tang dynasty's fascinating history, remember that their story is one of contrasts and complexities. From the bustling streets of Chang'an to the distant frontiers of Central Asia, the Tang emperors navigated a world of opportunities and challenges, leaving a legacy that continues to intrigue and inspire. But don't pack up your historical maps just yet. There's more to explore, more battles to fight, and more myths to bust as we delve deeper into the Tang dynasty's epic saga. Stay tuned, because the best is yet to come. As we delve into the Tang dynasty's decline, it's like watching a meticulously built sandcastle slowly succumb to the tide. The Tang, once a beacon of prosperity and culture, began to crumble under the weight of economic pressures, internal strife, and a few too many power-hungry warlords with delusions of grandeur. Let's break it down, shall we? First, the economy, because let's face it, money talks, even in the 9th century. The Tang dynasty's coffers were like a well-made chocolate fountain, glorious when flowing, disastrous when clogged. By the late 700s, the empire's financial situation was less Silk Road extravagance and more budgetary black hole. Why? Well, a series of costly military campaigns didn't help. The Anlushan Rebellion, 755-763 AD, for instance, wasn't just a footnote in a history book. It was an economic black hole that sucked up resources faster than you can say imperial deficit. This rebellion was led by Anlushan, a general who decided he was tired of taking orders and wanted to be the one giving them. With the charisma of a rock star and the ambition of a corporate raider, Anlushan rallied a massive army and declared himself emperor. The ensuing chaos lasted nearly a decade and left the Tang dynasty shaken, not stirred. It's hard to keep an empire running smoothly when half of it is on fire and the other half is busy wondering if they'll still have a job tomorrow. The rebellion was like a house party that got out of hand. By the time it ended, the Tang treasury was lighter by millions of strings of cash, the currency of the day. Government was forced to scrape together funds by increasing taxes and minting more coins, which led to, you guessed it, inflation. It's a tale as old as time. Too much money chasing too few goods, and suddenly your coins are worth less than the copper they're printed on. Meanwhile, the empire's social fabric was unraveling like an old sweater. The Tang dynasty's strict bureaucratic system, which had once ensured efficient governance, began to resemble a bureaucratic marsh pit. Corruption was rampant, with officials more interested in lining their pockets than serving the public. The examination system, that beacon of meritocracy, became a breeding ground for bribery, with positions going to the highest bidder rather than the most qualified candidate. As if that weren't enough, natural disasters piled on like a cosmic joke. Famine, drought, and floods became regular guests at the Tang dynasty's unfortunate party. These calamities weren't just bad luck. They were the result of environmental mismanagement, and a government too stretched to respond effectively. The people, already burdened by taxes and corruption, found themselves struggling to survive in a land that seemed to have turned against them. And let's not forget the internal rebellions, because what's an empire without a little domestic drama? The Huang Kao Rebellion, 874-884 AD, was another nail in the Tang coffin. Huang Kao, a salt merchant with a chip on his shoulder, gathered a band of rebels and wreaked havoc across the empire. His rebellion laid waste to cities and further destabilized the already teetering dynasty. By the time the dust settled, the Tang were like a boxer on the ropes, battered and gasping for breath. With the empire's central authority in tatters, regional warlords started eyeing the throne like contestants in a ruthless game show. These military governors, known as jidashi, were initially appointed to maintain order in the provinces. But as the Tang emperor's grip weakened, the jidashi began carving out their own fiefdoms, caring less about imperial edicts and more about their personal power. It was like giving a group of cats the keys to the kingdom. Chaos ensued. By 907 AD, The Tang dynasty was officially done for, collapsing under the weight of its own internal contradictions and external pressures. The last Tang emperor, Ai of Tang, was deposed by Zhu Wen, a former salt smuggler turned military governor who declared himself emperor of the new later Liang dynasty. Talk about a dramatic career change. Now, despite the messy end, the Tang dynasty left behind a cultural legacy that continues to resonate today. Their contributions to art, literature, and governance are like the echoes of a legendary rock band, still influential despite the group's breakup. The Tang poets, like Lai Bai and Du Fu, penned verses that have transcended time, capturing the human experience in a way that feels as fresh today as it did over a millennium ago. Their words are like the original viral tweets, spreading ideas and emotions across generations. The imperial examination system, despite its flaws, laid the groundwork for a meritocratic approach to governance that would influence China for centuries. It was a bold experiment in social mobility, even if it occasionally turned into a high-stakes game of who you know. The Tang's embrace of Buddhism, along with their openness to foreign cultures, created a melting pot of ideas that enriched Chinese society and left a lasting impact on East Asian civilization. In the end, the Tang dynasty's story is one of ambition, innovation, and ultimately, overreach. They soared to cultural heights that few empires could match, yet their fall reminds us that even the mightiest can stumble. It's a testament to the complexities of history that the same forces that drive greatness can also sow the seeds of downfall. So, as we bid farewell to the Tang dynasty, let's remember their legacy not just as a golden age, but as a cautionary tale about the delicate balance of power, prosperity, and human nature. In the chaotic tapestry of Roman history, Nero's early life is a tangled mess of ambition, power plays, and enough family drama to make any soap opera writer weep with envy. Born in 37 AD, little Lucius Domitius Ahenarbarbus, as he was then known, had barely cut his first tooth before he was thrust into a world where backstabbing was as common as breakfast. His bloodline was a veritable who's who of Rome's most notorious figures, starting with his mother, Agrippina the Younger. She was a woman so ambitious that ambitious seems like a polite understatement, the kind of person who could turn a brunch invitation into a power grab. Agrippina wasn't just any mother. She was the sister of Emperor Caligula, the infamous Roman leader whose reign was marked by debauchery, cruelty, and if rumors are to be believed, an attempt to make his horse a consul. Talk about setting the bar high for family expectations. With Caligula as her brother, Agrippina learned early that power was both a weapon and a currency. After Caligula's untimely assassination, because in Rome that was practically an occupational hazard, the throne was left wobbling and ready for the next contender. Enter Claudius, Rome's unlikely emperor, more known for his scholarly pursuits than his political prowess. To Agrippina, he was the perfect mark. She married him, becoming his fourth wife, because what's Rome without a little marital musical chairs, and set her sights on securing the throne for her son, Nero. Now, to fully appreciate the audacity of this move, consider that Nero was not Claudius's only heir. There was also Britannicus, Claudius's biological son. But Agrippina had plans, big ones. With a mix of cunning and charm, Agrippina convinced Claudius to adopt Nero, giving him a seat at the imperial table. This was no small feat. Adoption in Rome was a formal affair, much like signing a contract today, except instead of a notary, you had the entire Senate nodding along. It was official. Nero was now a legitimate heir, and boy, did things escalate from there. By 54 AD, Claudius was out of the picture, reportedly because of a dish of poisoned mushrooms, a Roman delicacy with a side of patricide, if you will. At just 16, Nero found himself emperor, thrust into a role that even the most seasoned ruler would find daunting. And here's where the myth and reality start to dance. Rome wasn't exactly a tranquil garden of democracy. It was more like a political gladiator arena where senators and generals plotted in the shadows, and the common populace could swing from adoration to rebellion faster than you can say, Circus Maximus. Nero's ascent was not simply the result of his mother's machinations. It was also a symptom of Rome's deep-seated political volatility. The empire was a beast that required constant feeding, often at the expense of its own leaders. There's a tendency to paint young Nero as a puppet, his strings pulled by Agrippina's deft hands. But let's not forget, Nero was a sharp teenager raised in this environment of intrigue. He knew the game, and more importantly, he was learning how to play it. Yet, as with any young ruler, there was the question of who really held the power, the emperor or the seasoned advisors whispering in his ear. Seneca, the famed philosopher, and Burrus, the Praetorian prefect, were Nero's mentors and political tutors. They were the steady hands trying to guide Nero through the stormy seas of Roman politics. With them steering the ship, Nero's early reign was surprisingly stable. Sure, there were the usual executions and exiles. This was Rome, after all. But on the whole, the empire was at peace, and the economy was humming along like a well-oiled chariot. And while Nero's reign is widely remembered for its excess and eventual descent into chaos, his early years were marked by relative calm, largely thanks to the influence of his advisors. But like any good episode of political drama, those early days also sowed the seeds of future turmoil. Agrippina's power was both her greatest asset and her Achilles' heel. As Nero grew into his role, tensions between mother and son began to simmer. The very ambition that had propelled him to power was now a threat to his autonomy. In the end, Nero's story is not just about one man's rise and fall. It's a reflection of the intricate, often brutal world of Roman politics, where alliances were as fragile as the egos involved, and ambition was a double-edged sword. This glimpse into Nero's early life offers a tantalizing preview of the chaos that would come, a prelude to the infamous tales that would cement his place in history as one of Rome's most notorious emperors. But for now, the stage was set, the players were in place, and the curtain of history was about to rise on one of Rome's most fascinating rulers. As Nero settled into his imperial throne, it seemed like Rome had lucked out with a golden boy, or so the spin doctors of the day would have you believe. Nero's early reign was peppered with progressive reforms and public works projects that promised prosperity. Picture this: a young emperor who, at first glance, appeared to be the poster child for benevolent leadership. But as with any good Roman drama, reality was a bit more complex than the PR machine suggested. Now, let's talk reforms. One of Nero's early moves was to reduce taxes, a crowd pleaser that even the most cynical Roman could appreciate. This wasn't just a case of Nero wanting to be popular. It was a strategic play to ensure the loyalty of the masses. Lower taxes meant more coin in the pockets of Roman citizens, and that kind of goodwill is hard to buy. Nero's administration also tackled corruption, at least on paper. He ordered investigations into past financial misdeeds, aiming to project an image of a ruler who wouldn't turn a blind eye to the dodgy dealings that plagued the empire's finances. Public works were also high on the agenda. Nero embarked on extensive building projects that were supposed to transform Rome into a jewel of the ancient world. He commissioned the construction of the Gymnasium and the grandly named Domus Transitoria, a lavish palace that was meant to be a testament to his greatness. But here's where things start to get a bit sticky. These projects weren't just about civic pride. They were also colossal money pits, slowly draining the imperial treasury. The grandeur of Nero's vision was undeniable, but with each new marble column erected, Rome's coffers felt a little lighter. While Nero's advisors crafted this image of an active, reform-minded emperor, Nero himself was increasingly captivated by the arts. Rome's ruler had a penchant for music and theater, which back then was a bit like finding out your CEO spent company funds on a rock band. Nero fancied himself a bit of a performer, and was known to indulge in long, drawn-out recitals that left his audiences captive, literally. People were reportedly not allowed to leave once one of Nero's performances began, a fate that sounds almost as terrifying as facing the lions in the Colosseum. Nero's love for the arts didn't just impact his schedule, it influenced his policies. He began pouring resources into cultural events and competitions, which, while entertaining, did little to bolster Rome's economic stability. Imagine spending millions on a lavish concert while your city's infrastructure crumbles. Sound familiar? It should, because it's a tale as old as time. Nero's artistic pursuits gave his critics plenty of fodder, and whispers of his frivolous spending started circulating around the empire. What began as a promising reign was slowly being overshadowed by Nero's desire to be the Cannae West of ancient Rome. All the while, the empire's treasury was feeling the pinch. The economic context of Nero's reign is crucial to understanding his story. Rome, like any sprawling empire, had a budget that wasn't exactly elastic. The empire relied heavily on taxes from its provinces, military spoils, and a network of trade that spanned continents. But Nero's expensive tastes and ambitious building projects meant that money was flowing out faster than it was coming in. The strain on the treasury was exacerbated by a series of unfortunate events, including a grain shortage that threatened to send bread prices through the roof. And in Rome, a city where bread and circuses were the keys to keeping the populace content, that was a recipe for disaster. To keep the empire afloat, Nero had to get creative, or as some might say, desperate. This led to some rather unpopular measures, like devaluing the Roman currency. Nero reduced the weight of the denarius, Rome's beloved silver coin, by 10%. It was an ancient version of quantitative easing, but instead of boosting the economy, it just made people feel like they were getting shortchanged. Inflation started to rear its ugly head, and the common folk began to grumble. It's one thing to attend a mandatory concert. It's another to realize your savings are now worth less than the emperor's latest toga. Nero's early reign, with its mix of promise and peril, set the stage for the chaos that was to come. While his advisors managed to maintain the illusion of stability, the cracks were beginning to show. Nero was a young man caught between the expectations of empire and his own personal passions. His story is a reminder that even the most well-intentioned reforms can falter under the weight of human ambition and economic reality. As the curtain continued to rise on Nero's rule, the audience in Rome, and history itself, was left wondering what act would follow. Nero's early reign might have been a roller coaster of reforms and artistic aspirations, but the ride was about to take a sharp turn into infamy with a blaze that would light up history books for centuries, into the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, a cataclysm that burned for 6 days, leaving 10 of Rome's 14 districts in ruins. This was no ordinary bonfire. It was a disaster of epic proportions that left both the plebeians and the patricians reeling. Now, let's tackle the elephant in the room, the infamous image of Nero fiddling while Rome burned. Spoiler alert, it's more fiction than fact. For starters, fiddles or violins didn't even exist back then. The closest thing they had was the lyre, a string instrument that was more harp than fiddle. So, while Nero was a fan of music, the idea of him serenading the flames with a violin solo is more medieval fantasy than Roman reality. But where did this fiery rumor come from? The story first appeared in the writings of historians like Suetonius and Tacitus, who weren't exactly card-carrying members of the Nero fan club. It's worth noting that these accounts were penned years after the blaze, and they leaned heavily on sensationalism, a bit like tabloids on a slow news day. Tacitus, for instance, suggests that Nero was in Antium when the fire started, which would make it difficult for him to play anything in Rome unless he had an ancient version of Skype. Nero's reaction to the fire was a mixed bag. On one hand, he threw open his gardens to house the displaced and organized food supplies, a move that on paper sounds downright humanitarian. On the other hand, he saw the charred ruins as an opportunity to indulge his grand architectural dreams. The rebuilding of Rome wasn't just about restoring what was lost. It was about creating something new, something Nero. The Domus Aurea, or Golden House, was his piece de resistance, a sprawling palace complex with an artificial lake and enough opulence to make Versailles look modest. But all this grandeur came at a cost, literally. Rebuilding Rome was no cheap endeavor. The economic ramifications were staggering, and the imperial treasury, already stretched thin by Nero's earlier projects and lavish lifestyle, was now gasping for air like a gladiator in the arena. To fund the reconstruction, Nero imposed heavy tributes on the provinces, squeezing them like a lemon in a Mediterranean cocktail. This move didn't exactly endear him to the provincial governors, who were already nursing their own post-fire headaches. And let's not forget the ripple effect on the Roman economy. With entire districts obliterated, job losses soared, and the demand for building materials skyrocketed. Rome's economy was a complex web of trade and commerce, and the fire had yanked out several key threads. Inflation was a beast that refused to be tamed, and Nero's earlier devaluation of the denarius only added fuel to the figurative fire. In the midst of all this chaos, Nero needed a scapegoat. Enter the Christians, a small but growing religious sect that was already unpopular with the Roman populace. Christians were easy targets. Their refusal to worship Roman gods or participate in traditional sacrifices painted them as outsiders. Nero charged them with arson, and the ensuing persecution was brutal. Christians were rounded up, tortured, and executed in gruesome public spectacles that would make even the most hardened Roman wince. This persecution served a dual purpose. It diverted attention from Nero's own questionable actions and provided the masses with a macabre form of entertainment. Bread and circuses, after all, were the tried and tested means of placating the Roman mob. But Nero's actions also planted the seeds for a narrative that would cast him as a villain for the ages. The Christian accounts, with their tales of martyrdom and resilience, further fueled the flames of Nero's infamy. Yet, one can't help but marvel at the paradox of Nero's rule. Here was a man who saw himself as an artist and a visionary, yet he became synonymous with tyranny and excess. His story is a testament to the thin line between genius and madness, between ambition and hubris. Nero's attempts to reshape Rome in his image were both his greatest achievement and his ultimate downfall. As we continue to peel back the layers of Nero's reign, it's clear that his legacy isn't just about a fire or a fiddle. It's a complex mosaic of power and paranoia, art and atrocity. The Great Fire of Rome may have been a pivotal event, but it was just one act in a much larger play, a drama that would continue to unfold, with Nero playing both the hero and the villain, often in the same scene. And as we move forward in this saga, we'll see how the flames of his ambitions continue to burn, threatening to consume not just him, but the very fabric of the empire he sought to glorify. And so, Nero's legacy was a complex tapestry woven with threads of ambition, madness, and the relentless pursuit of grandeur. But as the flames of his ambitions threatened to consume Rome, the emperor himself was spiraling into a world of paranoia and isolation worthy of a Shakespearean tragedy. By the time we reach his later years, Nero's reign had shifted from a promising start to a chaotic descent into tyranny, a transformation as dramatic as any of his beloved theatrical productions. First, let's set the stage with a little economic context. Remember that Treasury Nero had been hemorrhaging on palaces and performances. It was now emptier than a Roman amphitheater after the lions had their fill. The empire's finances were like an overdrawn bank account, and Nero's solution was to squeeze the provinces harder than a Roman tax collector eyeing a merchant's stall. But there's only so much you can milk from a cow before it kicks you in the face, and the provinces were getting restless. The emperor, whose love of the arts had once seemed charming, now appeared dangerously out of touch. Imagine your leader prioritizing a personal recital while the empire teeters on the brink of financial ruin. For Nero, the arts weren't just a hobby. They were an obsession, and the Roman elite were less than impressed. As Nero indulged his creative whims, the Senate's patience began to wear thinner than a toga after a year of fashionable feasting. Speaking of the Senate, it was becoming clear that Nero's support network was shrinking faster than a wool tunic in a Roman bathhouse. The political isolation was largely of his own making. His penchant for executing perceived enemies had turned Rome into a city of whispers, where every shadow held a potential conspirator. It wasn't just senators who were in danger. Even family members weren't safe. Nero had his own mother, Agrippina, killed in 59 AD, a move that would make even Oedipus blush. Talk about airing your dirty togas in public. As paranoia gripped Nero, his actions became increasingly erratic. He was convinced that plots against him lurked behind every marble column, in every shadowy corner of the Forum. And he wasn't entirely wrong. The political landscape of Rome was as treacherous as the Tiber in a storm, and Nero's reign had created plenty of enemies. His once powerful inner circle was dissolving. Seneca, his former tutor and advisor, was pushed aside, and Burrus, the Praetorian prefect, conveniently died, though whether by natural causes or imperial order remains a mystery wrapped in a toga. This brings us to the infamous Pisonian conspiracy of 65 AD, a plot that could have been lifted from the pages of a Roman thriller. It involved a wide array of conspirators, including senators, equestrians, and even a poet or two, because why not throw in some literary flair? Named after Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a noble with aspirations to rule, the conspiracy was a response to Nero's increasingly tyrannical rule. The plotters aimed to assassinate Nero and replace him with Piso, a man who, let's face it, was probably willing to promise anything for a shot at the throne. The conspiracy was a reflection of the growing discontent among Rome's elite. Nero's policies, his lavish spending, and his penchant for public spectacles had alienated those who had once supported him. The Pisonian plot was ambitious, involving a plan to attack Nero at a chariot race, a setting that would have provided both drama and an audience. But like many grand schemes, it was undone by loose lips. One of the conspirators, a freedman named Militius, exposed the plot in exchange for clemency, which was probably a smart move, considering the alternative was likely a date with the not-so-friendly lions. The fallout from the conspiracy was brutal. Nero's response was swift and merciless, a purge that sent shockwaves through Roman society. Senators were executed, others forced to commit suicide, and even those remotely connected to the plot found themselves in Nero's crosshairs. Seneca, who had retired to a life of philosophy, was implicated and ordered to take his own life, a task he faced with the stoicism you'd expect from a philosopher, albeit one with a tragic ending. This purge only deepened Nero's paranoia. His trust in those around him had evaporated, and his isolation was nearly complete. The emperor who once basked in the adoration of the masses now found himself a prisoner of his own palace, surrounded by sycophants and suspicious glances. Even the imperial guard, once loyal to a fault, was starting to question whether backing Nero was worth the potential career-ending consequences. Meanwhile, the public's opinion of Nero was crumbling faster than a Roman aqueduct hit by a barbarian siege. The people had once cheered his tax cuts and public works, but now they grumbled about the emperor's excesses and the economic strain his policies imposed. The grain shortages, the tax burdens on provinces, and the devaluation of currency were more than just numbers. They were daily realities for citizens trying to make ends meet. Nero's artistic ventures and opulent lifestyle were a bitter reminder of the widening gap between the emperor and his subjects. But despite all this, Nero's love for the arts never waned. He continued to perform, travel, and indulge his creative side, as if the empire's problems were mere background noise to his personal symphony. It was as if he believed that through sheer force of personality, he could bend reality to his artistic vision. It's a story as old as history itself. The ruler who loses sight of the world outside the palace walls, convinced that his passions are shared by all, when in reality, the world is moving on without him. In the end, Nero's later years were a masterclass in how quickly fortunes can change. From a promising start as a reform-minded emperor, he had become a symbol of excess and tyranny, his reign marked by paranoia, betrayal, and ultimately political isolation. The Pisonian conspiracy was a turning point, a moment when the masks fell away and the reality of Nero's rule was laid bare for all to see. As Nero continued down this path, the empire itself was teetering on the brink of chaos. The stage was set for the final act of his reign, a drama that would see the emperor confronted by the consequences of his own choices. But for now, Nero remained, resolute in his belief that he could somehow navigate the storm he had helped create, even as the waters rose around him. And in the echoes of history, we hear the familiar refrain, "Power, unchecked, rarely ends well." Nero, ever the performer, found himself unable to improvise his way out of the political quagmire that had become his empire. By 68 AD, the applause had turned to boos, and the Senate, that august body of Roman power, decided they'd had enough of Nero's one-man show. Nero's charm, once his greatest asset, was now as valuable as a broken lyre, and the Senate didn't just give him a bad review, they declared him a public enemy. Talk about getting cancelled on the grandest stage of them all. The declaration wasn't just political theatre, it was a death sentence. Nero, who had once revelled in the adoration of his subjects, was now a fugitive in his own city. The imperial guards, once his loyal band of brothers, turned their backs on him faster than a toga-clad crowd at a gladiator match. With the Senate's decree, Nero's support evaporated, leaving him more isolated than ever. As Nero fled Rome, he wasn't just running from political retribution. He was sprinting away from the reality he'd crafted with his own hubris. His flight led him to a villa outside the city, a far cry from the opulence of the Domus Aurea. Here, in this unceremonious setting, Nero's life came to a dramatic end. In a tragic twist befitting his theatrical inclinations, Nero chose suicide over capture, reportedly uttering the famous last words, "Qualis arifex perio." What an artist dies in me. It's hard not to admire the sheer drama, even as you shake your head at the absurdity of it all. With Nero's death, Rome was thrust into a chaos that would have made any playwright proud. The empire, now leaderless, entered the year of the 4 emperors, a chaotic period that sounds like the title of a fantasy novel, but was anything but fictional. In 69 AD, 4 different claimants to the throne jostled for power, each with their own legion-backed ambitions. This was political whack-a-mole on a grand scale, and the stakes were nothing less than the future of the Roman Empire itself. First, we had Galba, an old-school senator who was about as charismatic as a Roman column. His reign was so short it barely warranted a mention in the annals of history. Yet here we are. Galba's inability to pay the Praetorian Guard their promised bonus for supporting his claim was his downfall. In Rome, where soldiers were as mercenary as they come, loyalty was a commodity with a price tag attached. Next up was Otho, a man who had once been Nero's friend and confidant. Otho's reign was brief but eventful, marked by his attempt to bring some semblance of order back to Rome. Unfortunately, he faced Vidalius, a general with a penchant for excess rivaling Nero's own. Vidalius's forces defeated Otho's in the Battle of Bedriacum, and Otho, in true dramatic fashion, took his own life rather than face capture. Meanwhile, Vidalius celebrated his victory with a series of lavish banquets that would make even Nero's parties look like modest affairs. But Vidalius's gluttony was his Achilles' heel. As he feasted, another contender emerged, Vespasian, a seasoned military commander who had been securing Roman interests in the east. Vespasian's disciplined legions marched on Rome, and Vidalius, who had once dined with abandon, found himself cast out. The city, weary from the political upheaval, welcomed Vespasian as the stabilizing force it so desperately needed. Vespasian's ascent marked the end of the year of the 4 emperors, bringing a semblance of stability back to Rome. He was a pragmatic ruler, more concerned with repairing the fractured empire than indulging in personal excess. His reign saw the consolidation of power and a return to fiscal responsibility, as he rebuilt the treasury Nero had drained with his artistic pursuits. Now, let's sift through the ashes of Nero's legacy. Was he the tyrant history has painted him to be, or is there more to the story? Nero's reputation as a megalomaniac is deserved, but perhaps not the whole picture. He was a man of contradictions, a ruler who sought artistic acclaim even as he orchestrated political purges. His love for the arts, while seen as frivolous by his critics, was genuine. Nero fancied himself a patron of culture, albeit one whose artistic vision was often clouded by his unchecked power. The myth of Nero fiddling while Rome burned, though debunked, persists because it captures the essence of his rule, a leader out of touch with the realities of his empire. Yet, it's this very mythology that has cemented Nero's place in popular culture. He's a cautionary tale of how power can corrupt, a symbol of artistic ambition unchecked by political acumen. Nero's story endures because it's a timeless narrative of rise and fall, of human frailty in the face of absolute power. His reign, with its blend of theatricality and tyranny, serves as a reminder of the dangers of disconnect between ruler and ruled. In a way, Nero's legacy is less about the man himself and more about the enduring allure of his story, a tale of ambition, excess, and the ultimate cost of losing touch with reality. As history turns the page on Nero, one can't help but reflect on the lessons his life offers. In the grand amphitheater of time, Nero played his part with aplomb, leaving behind a legacy that continues to captivate and caution. And so, as the curtain falls on this chapter of Roman history, we're left with a final act that echoes through the ages, an artist's dream turned imperial nightmare, and the enduring question of how power, unchecked and unbalanced, can reshape the world. Welcome to the world of Spartan boys, where childhood dreams and cozy beds are swapped for the exhilarating yet brutal reality of the agoge. Yes, you, young Spartan, are about to embark on a journey that makes a boot camp look like a summer retreat. This isn't just any old training program. It's the legendary Spartan agoge, a rite of passage that made sure you weren't just another face in the crowd, but a cog in the well-oiled military machine of Sparta. Let's rewind the clock to around 650 BCE. At this time, Sparta wasn't the sun-drenched Greek vacation spot we might think of today. Nope, it was a powerhouse obsessed with one thing: military supremacy. Think of Sparta as that one guy at the gym who's always lifting weights, never skipping leg day, ensuring every muscle is ready for action. Why, you ask? Because they had a little something called the Peloponnesian League to lead, and they weren't about to let down the team. Now, why did Sparta prioritize military prowess over, say, developing the next great Greek playwright? Well, it's all about survival. Sparta wasn't all about olive oil and toga parties. It was about ensuring their society could withstand external threats and internal revolts, especially from the Helots, the subjugated locals who did all the heavy lifting, literally and figuratively. To keep the peace and maintain control, Sparta needed an army that was as fierce as it was disciplined. Enter the agoge. This isn't just a training program, it's a full-blown lifestyle makeover. At the tender age of 7, you leave behind the comfort of your family home. Forget mom's home-cooked meals and dad's bedtime stories. It's time to embrace the barracks life. Here, you'll find camaraderie and competition in equal measure. It's like Hogwarts, but instead of learning spells and potions, you're mastering the fine art of spear-wielding and shield-bashing. The Spartan society wasn't just a bunch of warriors running amok, though. It was meticulously organized, with a social structure that made sure everyone knew their place and role. The economy was mostly based on agriculture, thanks to the Helots who worked the land, ensuring the Spartan warriors could focus on more pressing matters. Like, not dying in battle. This allowed Spartan citizens to dedicate their lives to training and warfare, leaving the mundane tasks to the Helots. It's a bit like outsourcing, but with way more spears involved. But don't get too cozy with the idea of being a young warrior just yet. The agoge was designed to be tough, pushing you to your limits, and then some. Think of it as nature's way of saying, are you sure you want to be a Spartan? From day one, you're encouraged to be resourceful, to think on your feet, literally, since you'll be doing a lot of running, and to endure all sorts of hardships. It's like a reality TV show where the prize is survival, and the only way to get voted off is to fail spectacularly. Now, before you start thinking this was some ancient version of Lord of the Flies, let's add a bit of structure. The agoge wasn't just chaos. It was a carefully orchestrated system with rules, mentors, and goals. Spartan boys were taught to be obedient, loyal, and brave. Cowardice was a no-go, and showing fear was about as welcome as a rainstorm during a beach holiday. It was all about building character, or at least a version of it that could carry a shield and wield a sword with aplomb. So, as you settle into your new life, remember that this isn't just about becoming a soldier. It's about embodying the very essence of Spartan society. Your training isn't just for you. It's for the glory of Sparta, for the pride of your family, and let's be honest, for making sure those pesky Athenians don't get too full of themselves. You're not just a boy. You're a future warrior, a protector of the Spartan way, and one day, if you survive the agoge, a Spartan citizen with a voice in the assembly. As you drift off to sleep on your lumpy barrack bed, surrounded by fellow trainees and the occasional snoring mentor, remember that this was the life chosen by Spartans who came before you. It's not for everyone, but for those who can endure, it promises a legacy of strength and resilience. And who knows, maybe one day, people will tell tales of your feats, just like they do of the legendary King Leonidas. But that's a story for another day, and another night in the agoge. And so, young Spartan, as your eyes close, and you dream of glory or maybe just of a slightly softer bed, let's dive into what tomorrow, and every day thereafter, will hold in the agoge. First up, breakfast. Or rather, the Spartan version of it, which is less about fluffy pancakes and more about building that legendary Spartan grit. Forget about feasting. We're talking about a bowl of black broth. Yeah, you heard that right. This culinary delight involved blood, salt, and vinegar, because if you can stomach that, you can probably stomach anything life throws at you. The idea was to keep you lean, mean, and perpetually hungry, both literally and metaphorically, because a Spartan warrior's hunger for victory never truly subsides. And speaking of hunger, let's talk about the famous Spartan pastime of petty larceny. Stealing food wasn't just allowed, it was encouraged. Picture this. You're sneaking around the barracks like some ancient Greek James Bond, trying to nab a chunk of bread from under the noses of your comrades. If you got caught, it wasn't the act of stealing that earned you punishment. it was getting caught. This was less about turning you into a career criminal and more about honing your stealth skills. The logic was simple. If you could swipe a loaf of bread right out from under the watchful eye of your fellow Spartans, you could surely outwit an enemy on the battlefield. It's like training for a heist movie, except instead of diamonds, the prize is a stale roll. Now, let's not forget the physical training, which was about as gentle as a Spartan hug, meaning not at all. From dawn till dusk, you were put through the ringer. Running, wrestling, spear throwing, and shield handling were daily requirements. And just when you thought you had a handle on things, they'd throw in some pancration, a brutal fusion of boxing and wrestling. Think of it as the ancient precursor to MMA, only with fewer rules and more opportunities for bruising. It was all about building endurance and courage, teaching you to fight through the pain. Because in Spartan society, pain was just weakness leaving the body, preferably quickly and quietly. But why all this emphasis on endurance, you ask? In the grand scheme of Spartan life, there was no room for slackers. Every citizen was expected to contribute to the collective strength of the city-state. The agoge was the ultimate team-building exercise, with the stakes being life or death. Teamwork wasn't just a corporate buzzword, it was a survival tactic. You learned to trust your comrades with your life, because one day you might have to. Your success was their success, and your failure, well, we don't talk about that. Amidst all this training, you also learned to read and write, albeit just enough to receive orders and keep records. Sparta wasn't producing philosophers or playwrights, they were crafting warriors. This was a society that valued action over words, which might explain why so few Spartan texts have survived. They preferred their deeds to speak for them, and when your deeds involve holding back the Persian army at Thermopylae, who needs a bestseller? Now, let's tackle the myth of the perfect warrior. We've all heard the tales, Spartans standing on the battlefield, invincible and unyielding. But here's the reality check. No amount of training can make someone invincible. The truth is, the Spartans were human, with all the vulnerabilities that come with it. Their training produced disciplined soldiers, yes, but it also produced men who were, in many ways, shaped by fear. Fear of failure, fear of not living up to expectations, and the ever-looming fear of death. The agoge was as much about mental conditioning as it was physical, instilling a mindset that left little room for doubt or hesitation. It was a pressure cooker, and not everyone thrived under such conditions. This brings us to an uncomfortable question. Did the agoge create elite warriors or societal robots? The answer isn't as clear-cut as we'd like. On one hand, Spartan soldiers were renowned for their prowess and discipline, able to hold their ground against overwhelming odds. On the other hand, this same training system stifled individuality and creativity, which are often the seeds of innovation and progress. The emphasis on conformity and obedience left little room for personal growth outside the military sphere. It was a trade-off, unquestioning loyalty to Sparta in exchange for personal sacrifice. Economically, the system was sustainable only because of the Helots, who made up the majority of the population and took care of the agricultural labor. The Spartan citizens, free from such burdens, could focus entirely on their military duties. It was an efficient, if ethically questionable, setup. But it also meant that the Spartans were heavily reliant on a subjugated class, leading to a society always teetering on the edge of revolt. The constant threat of Helot uprisings only reinforced the need for a strong military presence, perpetuating the cycle of training and warfare. So, as you rise each morning, fueled by black broth and the determination to avoid punishment, remember that you're part of a grand experiment, one that values strength over all else. Whether this made you a hero or a pawn is a debate for historians, but there's no denying the impact of the Spartan way. As you practice your stealth, hone your endurance, and forge unbreakable bonds with your fellow trainees, you're shaping not just your destiny, but the fate of Sparta itself. And as the sun sets over the rugged Spartan landscape, you can rest assured that your place in history is being carved out with every grueling day you endure in the agoge. As the sun sets over the rugged Spartan landscape, you're shaping not just your destiny, but the fate of Sparta itself. And while you're out there perfecting your spear-throwing skills, let's dive deep into the mental gymnastics that the agoge demanded. Because if you thought the physical training was intense, wait till you hear about what it did to the mind. Welcome to the psychological boot camp of ancient Greece, where the curriculum was less about self-discovery and more about self-erasure. The agoge wasn't just chiseling a warrior's physique, it was carving a mentality that screamed, "Team first, me later." Obedience wasn't merely a trait, it was the bedrock upon which Spartan society stood. Picture this, a place where your personal aspirations were as relevant as last year's papyrus scroll. Individuality. Oh, that took a backseat so far down the line it might as well have been hitchhiking to Athens. But why such emphasis on conformity, you ask? Well, it all comes down to one word: loyalty. The Spartan system was like a well-oiled phalanx, where each warrior was just a cog in the grand machinery of state. Loyalty to the state wasn't just expected, it was demanded. A Spartan citizen was like a soldier with a single-minded focus, where loyalty to Sparta made personal bonds seem like an afterthought. The state was the family, the religion, and the reason for being. Now, if you're thinking, surely there was room for some personal connections, let's sprinkle in some historical wisdom. Ever heard of Plutarch? The ancient historian had a front-row seat to Spartan customs, and he tells us about the syssitia, or carmen messes. These were communal meals where men bonded over, wait for it, more black broth. These weren't your typical friendly hangouts. They were mandatory gatherings to reinforce unity and suppress any pesky notions of individuality. Imagine a dinner party where everyone wears the same toga, eats the same food, and toasts to the same mantra. For Sparta. And while we're on the subject of societal dynamics, let's not forget the women of Sparta. In a twist worthy of a Greek tragedy, Spartan women had more rights than their counterparts elsewhere in Greece. They could own property, receive an education, and were expected to be fit and healthy, to birth strong warriors, of course. But before we start applauding Sparta for early gender equality, let's peel back the layers. This freedom wasn't about empowerment, it was about practicality. Spartan women were the keepers of the household and land, while the men were off, doing their warrior thing. It was a role born out of necessity, not progressive thinking. The Spartan family structure was as robust as it was unusual. With men spending most of their time in training and warfare, family life was, shall we say, decentralized. Marriages were arranged, and love was often secondary to duty. Children were seen as future warriors or mothers of warriors. Even the concept of fatherhood was more communal than personal, as Plutarch notes in his writings. The state had a vested interest in every Spartan child's upbringing, ensuring that loyalty was drilled in from day one. But what about the cost of this unyielding loyalty? The price was individuality. The Spartan ethos was like a monochrome painting, impressive in its uniformity, but lacking the vivid hues of personal expression. Creativity was sacrificed on the altar of unity, and the few who dared to paint outside the lines were quickly brought back into the fold or faced consequences that weren't exactly gentle. The psychological strain of such an existence is hard to overstate. Imagine living in a world where questioning authority could earn you a spot on the wrong side of a disciplinary stick. The agoge was a relentless psychological gauntlet designed to stamp out self-doubt and replace it with unwavering confidence in the Spartan machine. But herein lies the paradox. While the training produced formidable warriors, it also crafted men who were, in many ways, prisoners of their own making, bound by the chains of conformity. And let's talk about the economic underbelly of this whole operation. The Spartan way of life was economically feasible because of the helots. These subjugated people were the backbone of Spartan agriculture, allowing citizens to focus on military endeavors without worrying about who was plowing the fields or harvesting the crops. But this dependency came with a hefty dose of anxiety. The helots outnumbered the Spartans, leading to a society perpetually perched on the precipice of revolt. To keep them in check, Spartans employed a mix of intimidation and outright brutality, a stark reminder that their vaunted freedom was built on a foundation of oppression. So, as you lay your head down each night, remember that you're not just training to be a warrior. You're learning to be part of a collective that values the whole over the individual. It's a life of sacrifice, where personal desires are subsumed by the greater good, and where the glory of Sparta is the ultimate goal. But as you drift off to sleep, perhaps dreaming of the day when you, too, will stand shoulder to shoulder with your fellow Spartans on the battlefield, consider this. In a society that valued obedience above all, was the cost of conformity a worthy price for peace and prosperity? Or did it create a generation of warriors who, while strong in body, were shackled in spirit? As the agoge continues to mold you, both physically and mentally, Keep in mind that the path to becoming a Spartan warrior is as much about the battles within as it is about the skirmishes without. And as the story of the Agoge unfolds, you'll find that the lessons learned here reverberate through history, shaping not just a warrior's life, but the very essence of what it means to be Spartan. So hold onto your shield, for the road ahead is as challenging as it is enlightening, and the journey is far from over. And as the story of the Agoge unfolds, you'll find that the lessons learned here reverberate through history, shaping not just a warrior's life, but the very essence of what it means to be Spartan. So hold onto your shield, for the road ahead is as challenging as it is enlightening, and the journey is far from over. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before you can stand tall in the phalanx, let's peek behind the iron curtain of Spartan lore and see how it held up when things got real. Enter Thermopylae, practically a synonym for heroic last stands. Picture this: 480 BCE, and King Leonidas is leading 300 Spartans against a Persian force that's all but bursting at the seams. We're talking somewhere in the ballpark of 100,000 to 150,000 soldiers, numbers that make the Spartan contingent look like a rounding error. Yet, thanks to the rigorous Agoge, Leonidas's men were not just any warriors. They were the Navy SEAL of the ancient world, minus the water and high-tech gear. Now, here's where the myth and reality start to tango. The Spartans, thanks to their training, held the narrow pass of Thermopylae for 3 days, battling waves of Persian troops. They were disciplined, sure, but let's not forget they were also fighting in a narrow corridor that essentially turned the battle into an ancient version of a marsh pit. Numbers meant less when you could only fit so many fighters at a time. Geography, as it turns out, was Sparta's silent ally. So, did the Agoge make these men invincible? Not quite. The Persian forces eventually outflanked them with the help of a local trader, and Leonidas and his Spartans met their end. The takeaway: while Spartan training made for unparalleled endurance and bravery, it wasn't a force field. The Spartan stand was indeed legendary, but it was also a poignant reminder that even the mightiest warriors have their Achilles heel. Sometimes it's a goat path and a well-timed betrayal. And let's chat about those economic and political gears grinding behind the scenes. Sparta's focus on military prowess wasn't just about flexing muscle on the battlefield. It was a survival strategy. Situated in the Peloponnesus, they had land but were light on fertile soil, unlike their Athenian neighbors who practically lived in an olive grove. This meant Sparta relied heavily on the Helots, those subjugated folks working the land. Without them, Spartan warriors would spend less time training and more time ploughing, hardly the stuff of epic poetry. The Helots' labor kept Sparta financially viable, but it was a double-edged sword. The economic engine thrummed along in part thanks to their toils, yet the constant fear of a Helot uprising meant Sparta had to maintain a formidable military to keep them in line. It's like having a guard dog that's also your biggest threat if it decides to turn on you. This dependency led to the infamous Cryptae, a secret police force of sorts, tasked with terrorizing the Helots to prevent rebellion. Talk about brutal efficiency. Politically, maintaining a warrior society was Sparta's ticket to influence. Leading the Peloponnesian League wasn't just about military supremacy. It was a way to exert control and ensure alliances. The Spartan system might have been harsh, but it was effective in creating a disciplined force that could project power and sway Greek politics. Think of it as ancient geopolitics with a heavy dose of spear-wielding persuasion. Yet, the costs of this perpetual war footing were immense. Spartan society was a pressure cooker, constantly on the brink of exploding from within. The lack of a diversified economy meant they couldn't afford setbacks. A major loss or prolonged conflict could cripple Sparta financially and socially. It's like living paycheck to paycheck, but instead of rent, you're paying with the blood and sweat of your citizen soldiers. Now, let's tackle another myth. Spartan military prowess was unrivaled. True, they were elite warriors, but they weren't invincible. Case in point, the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, where the Thebans, led by Epaminondas, handed the Spartans a resounding defeat. The Thebans used innovative tactics, such as a staggered phalanx, that outmaneuvered the Spartans' traditional strategies. This loss sent shockwaves through the Greek world, proof that even a well-oiled military machine could rust. The defeat at Leuctra was a wake-up call, underscoring the limits of a society so singularly focused on war. The Spartan way, while producing soldiers of extraordinary discipline, was inflexible. Innovation wasn't their strong suit, and when faced with an enemy that thought outside the box, they faltered. Turns out, a little creativity goes a long way on the battlefield. So, as you train and prepare to become part of this storied tradition, remember that the Spartan legacy is a mixed bag of success and failure, triumph and tragedy. The Agoge might have been a masterclass in endurance and loyalty, but it also came with a heavy toll, a society forever trapped in the cycle of war and subjugation, bound by the very system it created. In the end, the Spartan way of life was a balancing act on a razor's edge, where the line between hero and martyr was as thin as a sword's blade. As you continue your journey through the Agoge, know that you are part of a grand narrative that has captivated imaginations for centuries. But also remember the harsh realities that lay beneath the surface of those legendary tales, a world where the cost of power was often paid in blood and toil. As the Spartan sun rises once more, casting its light on a city that thrives on the strength of its warriors, the story of the Agoge continues to unfold. With each passing day, you become more than just a trainee. You become a living testament to the enduring legacy of Sparta. So gear up, young Spartan, for the lessons of history are far from over, and the path ahead promises both challenge and revelation. As the Spartan sun rises once more, casting its light on a city that thrives on the strength of its warriors, let's take a step back and examine the legacy of the Agoge. It's a story that's inspired everything from military boot camps to Hollywood blockbusters, and for good reason. The Spartan training system was a marvel of its time, churning out warriors who could make a lion look like a house cat. But let's not get too misty-eyed just yet. Behind the legend, there's a complex tapestry of triumphs and pitfalls, a narrative that continues to echo through the ages. First, let's talk about the enduring allure of the Spartan way. It's not just the chiseled physiques and bronze shields that captivate us. It's the sheer audacity of a society that dared to build itself entirely around the art of war. This wasn't just about flexing military muscle. It was a full-blown cultural identity. The Spartan ethos of discipline, loyalty, and sacrifice has been romanticized to the point where we forget it was less like a Hollywood blockbuster and more like a relentless grind. Yet, it's precisely this narrative that continues to resonate with us today. Even modern military academies incorporate elements of Spartan discipline, focusing on teamwork and resilience. Picture the classic image of a drill sergeant barking orders. There's more than little Spartan ethos in that. And let's not ignore pop culture's love affair with Sparta. Movies like 300 have made the Battle of Thermopylae a staple of cinematic glory, complete with slow-motion spear throws and dramatic speeches. But let's face it, while the film was visually stunning, it was about as historically accurate as a tabloid headline. There's a seductive simplicity to the idea of 300 warriors standing firm against impassable odds, and while it's a story worth telling, it glosses over the gritty realities. For instance, the actual number of Greek forces, including the Helots and other allies, was closer to 7,000. Still impressive, but not quite the intimate gathering of heroes that the film suggests. Now, let's shift gears and talk economics, the less glamorous, but no less critical backbone of Spartan society. The Helots, numbering perhaps 100,000 or more, were the unsung heroes or victims, depending on your perspective of the Spartan economy. These subjugated people ensured that Spartan citizens could focus on their military endeavors without worrying about where their next meal was coming from. But this reliance on a subjugated class was a ticking time bomb. The constant threat of Helot uprisings meant that the Spartans had to maintain a perpetual state of readiness. It's a bit like living in a fortress where the walls are both your protection and your prison. Politically, Sparta's singular focus on military might give them significant clout in the Greek world. They were the de facto leaders of the Peloponnesian League, and their influence was felt far and wide. But this came at a cost. The Spartan system was inflexible, resistant to change, and ultimately it was this rigidity that proved its undoing. When confronted with innovative tactics, like those employed by the Thebans at Leuctra, the Spartan war machine found itself outmaneuvered. It's a classic tale of the tortoise and the hare. Only this time, the tortoise had a few trick moves up its sleeve. So, was the Spartan discipline a triumph, or a cautionary tale? The answer is a resounding yes to both. On one hand, it produced warriors of unparalleled endurance and loyalty, men who could hold a line against overwhelming odds. On the other hand, it created a society that was so focused on the military that it left little room for anything else. Sparta's lack of cultural and economic diversity was a vulnerability, and when the tides of war turned against them, they found themselves precariously perched on the edge of oblivion. Yet, the Spartan legacy is nothing if not resilient. It continues to captivate us, not because of its perfection, but because of its audacity. The Spartans dared to defy the odds, to build a society that was both their greatest strength and their Achilles' heel. It's a story of human nature in its rawest form, ambitious, flawed, and endlessly fascinating. As you drift off into the realm of Morpheus, consider the lessons of Sparta. They are a testament to the power of discipline, the dangers of rigidity, and the enduring allure of a society that dared to dream big, even if it sometimes stumbled on the execution. The agoge may have been a crucible of hardship, but it was also a forge for the human spirit, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, the quest for glory and legacy is a tale as old as time. As the night deepens and you ponder the legacy of Sparta, take these lessons with you, a reminder that history is never just black and white, but a tapestry rich with color, complexity, and the occasional blood-stained spear.